Chapter 1. The Moment of Divergence. The battle raged across the valley floor like a storm that had forgotten how to end. 3 armies had come to fight over gold, and now 5 armies bled together in the shadow of the lonely mountain. Thorin Oakenshield had not expected this when he'd barricaded himself inside Erebor with his small company. He had expected siege, negotiation, perhaps even surrender. He had not expected war. But war had come anyway, and with it, the chance for something that burned in his chest like dragon fire: vengeance. Thorin pressed forward through the melee, his mail shirt torn and blooded, Orcrist singing its sharp song as it carved through the press of goblins. His breath came in harsh gasps, each one tasting of iron and smoke. Somewhere behind him, he could hear Dwalin's war cry echoing off the mountainside. Somewhere ahead, through the chaos of clashing steel and screaming horses, was Bolg. The pale orc towered above the battlefield, atop a massive ridge of stone and rubble, commanding his forces with gestures of his iron-studded mace. He had killed Fili. He had killed Kili. Thorin's sister sons, bright and brave and young, lay still somewhere in this carnage because of that creature's bloodlust. The rage that swept through him then was clean and terrible, burning away the last of his caution. Let Dain worry about tactics and retreat. Let Bard and Thranduil concern themselves with their own forces. Thorin had one purpose now, and it drove him forward like a spear thrust toward the heart. He hacked his way through a knot of goblins, their black blood spattering across his face. An orc blade scored his shoulder, and he barely felt it. Another caught him across the ribs, and he stepped into the blow to drive Orcrist up under its wielder's chin. The sword's weight was familiar in his hands, balanced and true, but his arms trembled now with exhaustion. He had been fighting for hours. Days, it felt like. None of that mattered. What mattered was the pale orc ahead, still too far to reach, still commanding, still breathing. Thorin stumbled over a fallen stone and caught himself with one hand, his vision wavering for a moment. When it cleared, Bolg was looking directly at him. Even across the distance, even through the swirl of battle, their eyes met. The orc's lips peeled back from his fangs in what might have been a smile. Good. Let the beast see him coming. Let it know who would end its miserable existence. Thorin forced himself upright and pressed on, step by bloody step. The slope grew steeper here, the footing more treacherous. Bodies lay scattered among the broken stones. Dwarf and man and elf and orc alike, all equal now in death. He stepped over them without looking down. His focus had narrowed to a single point, the pale orc waiting above. Bolg gestured, and suddenly the path ahead filled with goblins. They came at Thorin in a rush, screeching and gibbering, their crude weapons raised. He met them blade to blade, Orcrist flashing in the grey light. 1, 2, 3 fell before him, their blood adding to the crimson stain on his sword. But there were more behind them, always more, and each blow sent jolts of pain up his increasingly numb arms. A goblin spear caught him in the thigh, and he staggered. Another blade sliced across his forehead, and warm blood ran down into his eyes. Still he fought, because there was nothing else left to do. Because Fili and Kili lay dead somewhere below, and their killer still drew breath. The goblins pressed closer, sensing weakness. Thorin could feel his strength failing, could feel the cold edge of defeat creeping into his bones. He was still 40 feet from Bolg, and there were too many enemies between them. Too many, and he was just one dwarf, alone and bleeding. That was when he heard the soft whisper of steel behind him. A goblin that had been raising its sword to strike suddenly screamed and toppled forward, a hole punched clean through its back. Others began falling around it, crying out in shock and pain as wounds appeared from empty air. Thorin blinked blood from his eyes and tried to understand what he was seeing. Then he caught a glimpse of movement, the faintest shimmer in the air, like heat waves over summer stone. Something small and quick was moving among the goblins, and wherever it passed, they fell. A voice drifted to him, barely audible over the din of battle. "Come on, Thorin, up! Get up!" Bilbo Baggins, burglar and friend, was here in the thick of the fighting with that magic ring of his, clearing a path with Sting in his small, brave hands. The hobbit was terrified. Thorin could hear it in his voice. But he was here anyway, fighting for a dwarf who had called him traitor and cast him out. Something fierce and hot flared in Thorin's chest, burning away the grey fatigue that had been settling over him. He raised Orcrist and surged forward, following the invisible hobbit's wake. The remaining goblins fell back in confusion, unable to understand where their deaths were coming from. Thorin cut through them like a scythe through grain, his strength renewed by Bilbo's courage. Together, they climbed. Thorin could see the shimmer that was Bilbo moving ahead of him, hear the soft footfalls of hobbit feet on stone. Once, the burglar stumbled and became visible for just an instant, dirt-stained and wide-eyed, and gripping Sting like his life depended on it. Which Thorin supposed it did. Then the ring found him again, and he vanished. They reached the ridge where Bolg waited. The pale orc had been watching their approach with something like amusement, his iron mace resting across his shoulders. When Thorin finally stood before him, breathing hard and swaying on his feet, Bolg's laughter rumbled like distant thunder. "Little king comes to die," the orc said in the common tongue, his voice thick with mockery. "Where is your mountain now? Where are your armies?" Thorin said nothing. There was nothing to say. He raised Orcrist in both hands and prepared to meet his death as a king should, fighting. Bolg lifted his mace, muscles bunching under pale flesh. The weapon was easily as long as Thorin was tall, studded with iron spikes that had tasted the blood of his kin. It came down like a falling mountain. Thorin stepped aside, barely, too slowly, old reflexes failing him, and the mace crashed into the stone where he had been standing. Shards of rock exploded outward, one catching him across the cheek. He struck back with Orcrist, but Bolg was already moving, surprisingly quick for something so massive. The blade rang against the mace's handle and skittered away. They circled each other on the narrow ridge, predator and prey both, neither certain which was which. Bolg feinted with his mace, testing Thorin's reactions. Thorin gave ground, looking for an opening that might not come. He was tired. So tired. And the orc was fresh, confident, grinning those terrible fangs. Bolg attacked in earnest then, the mace whistling through the air in great sweeping arcs. Thorin parried desperately, each impact sending shockwaves up his arms. He was being driven backward toward the edge of the ridge and the long fall beyond. His heel caught on loose stone, and he stumbled. The mace came around in a horizontal swing that would have taken his head from his shoulders. Thorin dropped below it and rolled to one side, feeling the wind of its passage ruffle his hair. He came up in a crouch, Orcrist held low, and found himself staring at Bolg's unprotected legs. This was his chance. Perhaps his only chance. He gathered himself to spring forward, to drive his blade up into the orc's belly, and froze. Bilbo was there, invisible still, but Thorin could sense him somehow, crouched behind Bolg's left leg. The hobbit had his little sword raised, and from the way his position shifted, Thorin knew he was about to strike. For a heartbeat, time seemed suspended. Thorin saw how it would unfold. Bilbo would attack, Bolg would turn to face this new threat, and in that moment of distraction, the king under the mountain would die. The hobbit's courage would buy them both nothing but a slightly more heroic ending. Unless... Thorin met Bilbo's eyes, or where he thought they must be, and nodded once. Then he lunged forward, not at Bolg's exposed belly, but at his armored chest. It was a futile attack, one that would accomplish nothing except to draw the orc's attention fully onto himself. Except that Bilbo understood, in that same instant, as Bolg's focus fixed on the Dwarf King's desperate charge, Sting bit deep into the back of the orc's leg, slicing through tendon and muscle. Bolg roared and staggered, his weight shifting onto his wounded limb. And Thorin was there. Orcris took the pale orc just below the ribs, punching through mail and flesh and into the dark heart beyond. Bolg's eyes went wide with shock and pain. His mace tumbled from nerveless fingers to clatter on the stone. "For my sister sons," Thorin whispered, and twisted the blade. Bolg toppled backward, carrying Orcrist with him. Thorin, too exhausted to hold on, let the sword go and collapsed to his knees beside the dying orc. Blood was running freely from a dozen wounds now, and his vision kept trying to grey out at the edges. But he was alive. Somehow, impossibly, he was alive. A warm hand touched his shoulder, and Bilbo materialized beside him, the ring slipping from his finger. The hobbit's face was pale and splattered with orc blood, his respectable waistcoat torn and filthy. He looked, Thorin thought with a strange flicker of amusement, like he had been through a war. "Thorin," Bilbo said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "Thorin, can you—" "I live," Thorin managed. "Thanks to you, my brave burglar. I live." Below them, across the valley, the sounds of battle were changing. The harsh war cries of the goblins were fading, replaced by shouts of confusion and then retreat. Word of their leader's death was spreading like wildfire through the ranks. Without Bolg to command them, the orc army was beginning to break. Thorin closed his eyes and let the knowledge wash over him. It was finished. The battle was won. And somehow he would live to see what came after. What came after would change everything. But in that moment, with Bilbo's steady presence beside him and the weight of victory settling into his bones, Thorin Oakenshield simply breathed and was grateful for the chance to draw another breath. The tide of history had shifted on a ridge of stone, turned by the courage of a hobbit and the edge of a small, bright blade. Nothing would ever be the same. Chapter 2. Recovery and Reconciliation. The makeshift hospital in Dale smelled of herbs and old smoke, of bandages soaked in willowbark tea and the lingering ash from burned-out houses. Thorin woke to the sound of quiet voices and footsteps on stone, his body a map of aches and carefully tended wounds. Someone had stripped him of his battle-torn armor and dressed him in clean linen, and for a moment he couldn't remember where he was, or why his ribs felt like they'd been trampled by a mountain troll. Then it came back to him in pieces. The ridge, the pale orc, the moment when Bilbo's courage had saved them both. He was alive. Somehow, impossibly, he was alive. Easy now. A gentle hand pressed him back against the pillow as he tried to sit up. The voice belonged to a woman of Dale, her greying hair pulled back in a practical bun, her hands sure and steady on his shoulders. "You've been sleeping for 2 days. Your body needs time to remember how to heal." 2 days. Thorin let that settle into him, feeling strange and unmoored. In the stories, kings died glorious deaths in battle and left behind legends. They didn't wake up in improvised hospitals with their ribs wrapped in linen and their pride in tatters around them like discarded armor. My people?" he asked, his voice little more than a croak. The healer's expression, softened with something that might have been pity. Your cousin Dain tends to the living. Your nephews. She didn't finish, but then she didn't need to. Thorin closed his eyes and felt the weight of it settle on his chest like stones. Fili and Kili were dead. Bright, brave boys who had followed him into exile and then into war, and now they would never see another sunrise or share another jest around a campfire. They had died because he had been too proud to listen, too consumed by gold sickness to see the trap closing around them all. "I want to see Bilbo Baggins," Thorin said. The healer frowned. "The Hobbit? He's been here every day, waiting for you to wake. But you shouldn't strain yourself with, 'Please!'" The word came out harder than he'd intended, edged with the authority of kingship that he wasn't sure he deserved anymore. "I need to see him." She studied his face for a long moment, then nodded. "I'll fetch him. But you'll rest afterward, whether you want to or not. I've tended enough stubborn dwarves to know the signs." Thorin managed what might have been a smile. "Thank you." Bilbo arrived within minutes, looking cleaner than he had on the battlefield, but no less tired. His clothes were different, borrowed from the men of Dale, probably, since his own had been torn to rags, and there were fresh lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before the battle. When he saw that Thorin was awake, relief flooded his face like sunrise. "You great fool," the hobbit said, settling carefully into the chair beside the bed. "You absolute, pig-headed, impossible dwarf. Do you have any idea how worried we've all been?" "We?" Thorin asked, though he thought he could guess. "Balin's been pacing holes in the floor. Dwalin keeps sharpening his axes like he's planning to fight death himself, if you don't recover. And don't get me started on the way Beaufort's been carrying on." Bilbo's voice was light, but his hands trembled slightly as he folded them in his lap. "You nearly died, Thorin. You nearly died, and the last words between us were..." Angry words, harsh words, words spoken in the grip of dragon sickness when Thorin had valued gold over friendship and called the hobbit traitor for trying to prevent a war. The memory of it sat bitter in his throat. "I was wrong," Thorin said simply. "About the treasure, about the agreements my grandfather made, about you." He met Bilbo's eyes, unflinching. "You showed more courage on that ridge than I have shown in months. You saved my life when I had given you every reason to let me fall. I owe you an apology that no words can properly hold." Bilbo was quiet for a long moment, studying the worn stone of the floor. When he looked up, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "You were sick, Thorin. The gold, the dragon's influence. It wasn't entirely you. It was me," Thorin said firmly. "The sickness gave me excuses for choices I made. But I made them, and I will make amends for them, if you'll allow me the chance." The hobbit reached out and gripped his hand, warm and steady and real. "Of course I will. That's what friends do, isn't it?" Friends. Such a simple word, and yet it carried more weight than all the gold in Erebor. Thorin squeezed Bilbo's fingers and felt something tight in his chest finally begin to loosen. "There's something else," Bilbo said, his tone shifting to something more serious. "Bard and Thranduil are waiting to speak with you. They've been patient, but there are agreements to honor. Promises that need keeping." Thorin nodded. He had known this was coming, had been dreading it even as he'd known it was necessary. The 14th share of the treasure that was rightfully theirs, the recompense for the destruction of Lake Town, the debts his pride had made him try to avoid. "Send them in," he said. "It's time I faced what I owe." Bard arrived first, looking every inch the king he had become in the aftermath of Smaug's death. The bowman had traded his simple archer's gear for the practical garments of a leader, good wool and leather, well made, but not ostentatious. When he saw Thorin awake and alert, something like relief crossed his weathered features. "Master Oakenshield," he said, inclining his head slightly. "I'm glad to see you recovering." "King Bard," Thorin replied, offering what courtesy he could manage from his sickbed. "I owe you my thanks for the care your people have given me. And I owe you much more, besides." Bard's expression grew carefully neutral. "Do you?" "The 14th share," Thorin said without preamble, "as agreed between Bilbo and your people. I was wrong to withhold it. The sickness in me spoke louder than honor, and for that I ask your pardon." Surprise flickered across the man's face, there and gone so quickly Thorin might have imagined it. "You mean to honor the agreement?" "I mean to honor all the agreements my grandfather made," Thorin said. "Lake Town's recompense, the trade arrangements, the mutual defense pacts, everything that should have been settled months ago, if I had not been blinded by greed and old grudges." This time Bard's surprise was unmistakable. He glanced at Bilbo, who nodded slightly, then back to Thorin. "That is generous. More than generous, considering the circumstances." "It is what's right," Thorin said, "and it's long overdue." When Thranduil arrived, he brought with him that particular quality of stillness that belonged to the elves, as if he moved through the world at a different pace than mortal folk, unhurried and unchanging. His pale robes were unmarked by the recent battle, his silver crown catching the afternoon light that slanted through the hospital's narrow windows. He regarded Thorin with those ageless eyes, and said nothing. "My lord Thranduil," Thorin began, then stopped, gathering himself. The words he needed to say felt rusty in his throat, unused for too long. "I have done you dishonor. You came in good faith to treat with me, and I let old anger cloud my judgment. I spoke harshly of wrongs done generations past, when I should have spoken of the future we might build together." Thranduil's expression didn't change, but something subtle shifted in his posture. "You offer apology?" "I offer more than that," Thorin said. "I offer the partnership my people and yours should have had from the beginning. Trade routes and mutual defense. Shared knowledge of the growing darkness in the world. My grandfather's agreements with the woodland realm, honored in full." For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the distant murmur of voices from elsewhere in the makeshift hospital. Then Thranduil inclined his head, a gesture so slight it might have been a trick of the light. "I accept," he said simply. "The past need not poison the future, if we have the wisdom to let it go." Later, when the formal words had been spoken and the agreement struck, Thorin found himself alone with his thoughts and his grief. The healer had been right. The talking had exhausted him more than any physical exertion. But it was a clean exhaustion, the kind that came from necessary work finally done. Dain arrived with the sunset, his iron-grey beard still braided for war, his armor showing the fresh dents and scrapes of recent battle. He stood in the doorway for a moment, just looking, and Thorin could see the complex mix of emotions playing across his cousin's weathered face. Relief. Joy. And underneath it all, a thread of something that might have been disappointment. "Thorin," Dain said finally, coming to stand beside the bed. "You stubborn, impossible fool. When they told me you were alive, I didn't believe it at first." "I can hardly believe it myself," Thorin admitted. "Bilbo Baggins saved my life. Without him, I would have fallen to Bolg's mace." Dain nodded slowly. "The hobbits already told me the tale. Brave little fellow. He was quiet for a moment. Then, this complicates things. There it was. The heart of it, spoken plain. Dain had come to the battle expecting to find his cousin dead and the throne of Erebor empty. He had come prepared to take up a crown and the burden of kingship. Instead, he had found Thorin alive, but changed, humbled by his near death, and freed from the dragon sickness that had clouded his judgment. "It doesn't have to," Thorin said carefully. "You came here to be king under the mountain. That can still be so." Dain's eyebrows rose. "You would yield your claim?" "I would honor yours," Thorin corrected. "You are older, wiser, and you have not spent months making enemies where you should have made allies. The kingdom needs steady leadership, not the kind of pride that nearly cost us everything." "And what would you do?" Dain asked. Thorin considered that. What did an exiled king do when he had found his way home, only to discover that home had outgrown his ability to rule it? What purpose was there for a warrior whose last battle had taught him the cost of letting rage guide his sword? "I would serve," he said finally. "As your marshal, perhaps. As your advisor. As whatever you need me to be." He met his cousin's eyes. "There is still work to do, Dain. The darkness in the world grows stronger, and we will need all our strength to face what's coming. I cannot wear a crown with wisdom, but I can still swing a sword with skill." Dain was quiet for a long time, his gaze distant with thought. When he spoke again, his voice was gentle with understanding. "You've changed, cousin." "I've learned," Thorin said. "Finally, and almost too late. But I've learned." He thought of Fili and Kylie, bright lives snuffed out because of his pride. "I pray the lesson proves worth its cost." "It will," Dain said firmly. "I'll take the crown, if that's truly what you wish. But I'll want you beside me. Your experience, your knowledge of the mountain and its defenses, we'll need all of it in the years to come." Outside, the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the ruins of Dale, his surviving company would be grieving their fallen and trying to make sense of a victory that felt like defeat. Somewhere else, Bilbo would be preparing for his long journey home to the Shire, carrying memories of friendship and loss that would mark him forever. And here in this quiet room, a king had learned to let go of his crown and found something more valuable in its place. The chance to serve, to protect, to build something lasting instead of simply hoarding what had come before. It was not the ending Thorin had imagined for his story. But perhaps, he thought, as sleep began to claim him, it was the beginning of something better. Chapter 3. The Weight of Survival. The tombs were carved from the living rock of Erebor itself, deep chambers that echoed with the weight of silence and sorrow. Thorin stood before two fresh-sealed alcoves, his hand steady on his walking stick, but his heart anything but still. The master carvers had worked through the night to prepare the resting places, and now Fili and Kili lay in eternal darkness, their young faces peaceful in death as they had rarely been in life. Someone had placed their weapons beside them. Fili's twin blades crossed over his chest, Kili's bow strung one final time. Small tokens from the other members of the company lay scattered around them. Bofur's carving tools, Ori's inkwell, a braid of Dwalin's hair woven with silver thread. Even in death, they were not alone. But they were dead, and Thorin was not, and that simple fact sat in his stomach like a stone. "They followed you because they believed in you," Balin said, quietly from behind him. The old dwarf had grown greyer in the weeks since the battle, the lines around his eyes deeper with grief and exhaustion. They knew the risks. They were children, Thorin replied, his voice hollow in the stone chamber. Barely grown, with so much life ahead of them. They should have lived to see grandchildren, to grow old and wise and— He stopped, unable to finish. What was the use of should-have-beens? The dead cared nothing for regrets. Aye, Balin said simply. They should have, but they made their choice, lad. The same as you did. The same as all of us did. Thorin knelt carefully, his healing wounds protesting the movement, and placed his hand on Fili's tomb. The stone was cold beneath his palm, unyielding as death itself. I should have listened to you, he whispered to the silence. Both of you. You tried to warn me, tried to pull me back from the edge of madness, and I cast you aside. I let gold become more important than family. The tomb offered no absolution, no forgiveness, only silence, and the weight of choices that could never be unmade. When Thorin finally emerged from the depths, the sun was setting over the valley, painting the devastated landscape in shades of amber and crimson. The battlefield had been cleared, the dead buried or burned according to their customs, but the scars remained. Broken weapons and scorched earth, the ruins of war machines, and the dark stains where too much blood had been spilled. Dain was waiting for him in the great hall, surrounded by the surviving members of both their companies. Maps were spread across the massive table, marked with the positions of dwarf settlements and trade routes, defensive positions and supply lines. The work of rebuilding had already begun, even as they still counted their losses. "Cousin," Dain said, looking up from the parchments, "there are matters that need your attention." Thorin nodded, settling himself into a chair with more care than he would have liked. His ribs were still tender, and the healer had been quite explicit about what would happen if he pushed himself too hard too soon. "What news?" "The families of the fallen," Dain said gently. "They've come to pay their respects and to collect their loved ones' share of the treasure. It's traditional, but given the circumstances—" "I'll see them," Thorin said immediately. "All of them. They deserve to hear from their king why their sons and fathers and brothers died for my pride." "Former king," Dain reminded him, not unkindly. "Yes," Thorin agreed, "former king. But they died following me, not you. The responsibility is mine." The meetings were harder than facing down a dragon would have been. Thorin sat in a smaller chamber off the main hall, a simple room with good light and comfortable chairs, and welcomed each grieving family with the respect and dignity their sacrifice deserved. They came in ones and twos, a widow clutching her husband's helm, a father carrying his son's shield, mothers whose eyes were red with weeping, but whose backs remained straight with dwarvish pride. To each he offered the same things, their loved one's share of the treasure, carefully calculated and respectfully presented. The story of how their kin had died, told without embellishment or false comfort, and his personal apology for the choices that had led them all to that bloody field. Most accepted both treasure and apology with quiet grace. A few refused the gold entirely, saying it was cursed with their grief. One or two spoke harsh words about kings who valued stone and metal over flesh and blood. Thorin bore it all without protest, because every word was deserved, and more besides. The last to come was Gimli, son of Gloin, barely past his majority, but already bearing his father's axe and his grandfather's stern expression. The young dwarf had fought bravely in the battle, Dain had told him, standing shield to shield with warriors twice his age and never giving ground. "Master Gimli," Thorin said, rising to greet him, Your father spoke of you often during our journey. He was proud of your courage." "Was he?" Gimli asked, his voice carefully controlled. He spoke little of pride in his final moments, only of regret that he would not see me wed or hold his grandchildren. The words hit like a physical blow, and Thorin had to force himself to remain standing. "I'm sorry," he said, and the words felt pathetically inadequate. He was a good friend and a brave warrior. His loss is one among many," Gimli interrupted, "and they all followed you into that battle, believing you knew the way to victory." The young dwarf's eyes were hard, but not with hatred, with the terrible weight of understanding. "I don't blame you, Thorin Oakenshield. My father made his choice with open eyes, but I'll not pretend his death was glorious, or that it served some greater good. He died for treasure that already belonged to our people, fighting enemies who might have been reasoned with if pride hadn't closed all doors to compromise." Thorin met his gaze steadily. "You're right, and I'll spend whatever time remains to me trying to ensure such waste never happens again." Gimli studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "See that you do. The dead deserve that much." He accepted his father's share of the treasure without further comment, and left, his footsteps echoing in the corridor long after he'd disappeared. Later that evening, Thorin found himself in the armory, watching Dwalin train a group of young dwarves in swordwork. His old friend moved among them with the patience of long experience, correcting stances and demonstrating proper form with the economy of motion that marked a true master. The students were eager but green, barely old enough to lift their weapons properly, let alone wield them in true combat. "New recruits?" Thorin asked, settling onto a bench against the wall. Dwalin glanced over, wiping sweat from his brow. "Volunteers." Word spread about growing troubles in the east, and every young hothead with dreams of glory wants to serve the crown. His expression darkened. Most of them have no idea what they're asking for. Thorin watched a particularly young dwarf, couldn't be more than 40, struggling with a practiced sword that seemed almost too heavy for his arms. There was something heartbreakingly familiar about his earnest determination, his absolute certainty that courage and good intentions would be enough to see him through whatever trials lay ahead. "We need to train them properly," Thorin said. "Not just in sword work, but in the reality of what war actually means. They should know the cost before they choose to pay it." "Aye," Dwalin agreed grimly. "I've been thinking the same. Perhaps—" He hesitated, then continued. "Perhaps it's time we established something new. A guard unit dedicated not just to fighting, but to remembering, to making sure the lessons of the 5 armies aren't lost when the old warriors pass on." The idea took shape in Thorin's mind as Dwalin spoke, crystallizing into something that felt both necessary and right. "The Memorial Guard," he said slowly. "Elite warriors trained not just in combat, but in the stories of those who've fallen. They would carry the memory of our losses forward, make sure every new generation understands what their service truly costs." "You'd lead such a unit?" Dwalin asked. Thorin considered that. He was no longer king, no longer the final authority in matters of war and peace, but he was still a warrior, still someone who understood both the necessity of violence and its true price. "If Dain approves, yes. It seems fitting." They worked through the details as the training session continued around them. The Memorial Guard would be small, no more than a dozen at first, but highly skilled. They would serve as both elite troops and living libraries, keeper of stories and guardian of hard-won wisdom. Each member would be required to learn the tale of at least one fallen warrior, to carry their memory and their lessons into future battles. When Bilbo appeared in the doorway, still dressed in his borrowed Dale clothing, but carrying a pack that suggested imminent departure, Thorin felt his heart sink. He had known this moment was coming, had dreaded it even as he'd understood its necessity. The hobbit belonged in the Shire, not in the harsh stone halls of a mountain kingdom. "Master Baggins," Dwalin said warmly, pausing in his instruction. "Come to say farewell, have you?" "I'm afraid so," Bilbo replied, though his eyes were on Thorin. "The roads will be closing soon with winter coming, and I have a garden that's probably overgrown with weeds by now." He attempted a smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "A burglar's work is never done, it seems." Thorin rose slowly, aware that this might be the last time he ever saw his friend's face. "Will you walk with me?" he asked. "There are things I'd like to say before you go." They made their way to one of Erebor's many balconies, a platform carved from the mountain's face that offered a sweeping view of the valley below. The lights of Dale twinkled in the gathering darkness, and beyond them, the darker mass of Mirkwood stretched toward the horizon. It was beautiful in its way, this land they had fought for, but Thorin found himself wondering if it had been worth the price in blood and grief. "I wanted to thank you again," he said, as they stood at the stone railing. "Not just for saving my life, but for showing me what true courage looks like. You had every reason to abandon me after the way I treated you, and instead, you risked everything to pull me back from the edge." Bilbo was quiet for a moment, his hands folded on the railing. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "You know, I've been thinking about that, about why I couldn't just let you fall." He glanced at Thorin, his expression serious. "I think it's because I saw something in you that you'd forgotten was there. The dwarf who sat by our fire in Bag End and told stories of your grandfather's courage. The king who cared more about his people's future than his own glory." "That dwarf made terrible mistakes," Thorin said heavily. "Yes, he did," Bilbo agreed, "but he learned from them, and he's trying to do better now. That's all any of us can do, isn't it? Try to be better tomorrow than we were today." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. Finally, Thorin reached into his coat and withdrew a small object wrapped in silk cloth. "I wanted to give you something," he said, unfolding the fabric to reveal a simple chain of mithril, delicately wrought but sturdy enough to last for centuries. "It's not much compared to what you've given me. But it's beautiful," Bilbo said softly, accepting the chain with obvious reverence. "But Thorin, I can't accept something so valuable. Mithril is worth more than—" "More than a life?" Thorin interrupted gently. "More than friendship? More than the chance to become something better than I was?" He shook his head. "Keep it, my friend. And when you look at it, remember that there are those in this world who think of you as the greatest treasure of all." When Bilbo finally left the next morning, Thorin stood on the great stairs of Erebor and watched until the hobbit's small figure disappeared into the distance. Part of him wanted to call out, to ask his friend to stay and help rebuild what they had all fought to save. But Bilbo had his own life to live, his own peace to find, and it would be selfish to ask him to sacrifice that for dwarven concerns. That afternoon brought unexpected visitors. Gandalf arrived with little fanfare, his grey robes travel-stained, and his expression more serious than usual. With him came a figure Thorin had not expected to see again. Radagast the Brown, his wild hair even more dishevelled than memory suggested, his eyes bright with urgency. They met in Dain's private study, a smaller chamber lined with books and maps, where the new king conducted his most sensitive business. Gandalf wasted no time on pleasantries. "There are dark tidings from the east," the wizard said without preamble. "The necromancer has fled Dol Guldur, but he has not been destroyed. Indeed, we fear he has returned to his ancient stronghold in Mordor." Dain leaned forward in his chair. "The necromancer? I thought that was some tale to frighten children." "Would that it were," Radagast said, his voice unusually grim. "I have seen the signs in the forest. The trees themselves whisper of growing darkness, and my animal friends flee south in numbers I have never witnessed." Thorin felt a chill settle into his bones that had nothing to do with the mountain's stone halls. "What does this mean for us? For Erebor and the northern kingdoms?" Gandalf's grey eyes were troubled. "I fear it means that the battles you have recently fought may prove to be only the beginning. The enemy, for enemy he is, make no mistake, will seek to reclaim his dominion over all Middle-earth. When he moves openly, no realm will be safe from his malice." "Then we must prepare," Dain said firmly. "Strengthen our defenses, forge new alliances, gather what strength we can." "Yes," Gandalf agreed, "but carefully, and in secret for now. The enemy's spies are many, and we must not reveal our hand too early." He turned to Thorin. "Your experience in battle, your knowledge of the mountain's defenses, they may prove invaluable in the dark times ahead." Thorin nodded slowly, feeling the weight of new purpose settling on his shoulders. He had survived when others had fallen, had been granted a second chance at life and leadership. Perhaps this was why. Perhaps everything that had happened, the quest, the battle, even his survival, had been leading to this moment. "Whatever comes," he said quietly, "we'll face it together. The mistakes of the past won't be repeated." As the sun set behind the peaks of the lonely mountain, casting long shadows across the valley below, Thorin stood at his window and contemplated the future. The dead were honored and buried. The treasure was distributed fairly. His people were safe behind strong walls and under wise leadership. But in the east, darkness was stirring, and the peace they had fought so hard to win might prove more fragile than any of them had dared to imagine. The weight of survival pressed down upon him like mountain stone, heavy with responsibility and the knowledge that harder trials lay ahead. Yet for the first time since waking in that makeshift hospital, Thorin felt something like hope. He had learned to bear the weight of his choices. Now it remained to be seen whether he could bear the weight of the choices yet to come. Chapter 4. The Messenger from Dol Guldur. The raven arrived at dawn, its black wings cutting through the grey morning light like an omen of ill news. Thorin watched from Erebor's main gates as the bird settled on the stone perch reserved for such messengers, a scroll bearing Thranduil's seal tied to its leg with silver cord. Ravens brought word from distant places, but they rarely brought good tidings. "News from the woodland realm, my lord," said the courier who retrieved the message, offering it to Dain with the formal courtesy due a king. But Dain was deep in discussion with his treasury advisers, and he gestured toward Thorin with the casual authority of a ruler who trusted his marshal completely. Thorin broke the green wax seal and unrolled the parchment, his eyes scanning the flowing elvish script. Thranduil's hand was elegant as always, but there was an urgency beneath the formal language that made Thorin's chest tighten with unease. "What word?" Dain asked, finally dismissing his advisers with a wave. "Dol Guldur," Thorin said, his voice flat. "Thranduil's scouts report that the fortress has been abandoned, emptied. Whatever darkness held court, there has fled in the night." Dain's eyebrows rose. "Fled? Or been driven out?" Thorin read further, then looked up with troubled eyes. "Both, perhaps. He mentioned strange lights seen from the direction of the fortress 3 nights past. Flashes of gold and silver, like lightning but lasting too long. Then silence. His border guards investigated at first light, and found only empty halls and cold hearths. And he wants our aid in a full investigation. The alliance agreement includes mutual assistance in matters of border security. Thorin folded the message carefully. He's right to be concerned. Whatever power commanded from Dol Guldur, it was no friend to any of the free peoples. If it's moved elsewhere, it might be planning something worse, Dain finished grimly. How many men does he request? Thorin consulted the message again. 12. Enough to provide security for his investigators, but not so many as to appear an invasion force. He paused, then added, He specifically requests that I lead them. It seems our new friendship carries weight with him. As it should, Dain said with satisfaction. You'll take volunteers from the Memorial Guard? If they're willing. The Memorial Guard had grown to 8 members in the weeks since its founding, each one a veteran warrior who had proven both skill in combat and wisdom in judgment. They would serve well in the shadowed halls of Mirkwood's greatest threat. And I'll want Dwalin with me, if he can be spared. Of course. When do you leave? Thorin looked toward the narrow windows, where the morning sun was climbing higher above the peaks. Today, if the men can be ready. Whatever happened at Dol Guldur, the trail grows colder with each hour we delay. By midday, a small company of 12 dwarves rode out from Erebor's gates, their weapons sharp and their supplies carefully chosen for speed rather than comfort. Thorin led them down the familiar paths toward Mirkwood, but this time the forest held no sense of homecoming, only a creeping dread that seemed to thicken with each mile. The border guards who met them were elves of Thranduil's household guard, tall and stern with the ageless faces of their kind. But even immortal composure could not entirely hide their unease as they guided the dwarf company through increasingly dark and twisted paths. The corruption spreads faster now, explained Galion, the king's butler who had volunteered to guide them. His usual haughty demeanor had been replaced by genuine concern. Plants that were green yesterday wither today. The very air tastes of shadow and fear. They rode for 2 days through the increasingly blighted forest, camping each night in clearings where the starlight could still reach them through the canopy. Thorin found himself grateful for Dwalin's steady presence beside him, and for the quiet competence of the Memorial Guard. These were dwarves who had seen the worst of war, and emerged with their courage intact. Dol Guldur rose from the forest's heart like a wound in the world itself. The fortress had always been a place of shadow, but now it seemed actively malevolent, its black towers clawing at the sky with desperate hunger. Whatever power had dwelt there for so many centuries had left its mark on the very stones. Thranduil met them at what had once been the main gate, now standing open and unguarded for the first time in living memory. The Elven King's usual immaculate appearance showed signs of strain. His robes were travel-stained, and there were lines of weariness around his ancient eyes. "Master Thorin," he said, inclining his head with genuine warmth, "thank you for coming so swiftly. I confess, I am reluctant to enter those halls with only elven swords at my back." "What have your scouts discovered?" Thorin asked, dismounting and studying the fortress with a soldier's eye. The outer walls showed no signs of battle, no evidence of siege or assault. Whatever had driven out the darkness had done so through other means. Very little, I fear. The outer chambers are empty, but for dust and the lingering taste of malice. Deeper into the fortress. Thranduil's expression darkened. "Deeper, my people will not go." There are things in those depths that turn strong hearts to water and send brave warriors fleeing like children. Thorin nodded grimly. Then we go together, dwarf courage and elven wisdom. Between us, perhaps we can learn what we need to know. The interior of Dol Guldur was a maze of corridors and chambers carved from living rock, each one more oppressive than the last. Their torches cast dancing shadows on walls that seemed to drink in the light, and more than once Thorin found himself checking over his shoulder for threats that existed more in imagination than reality. The first few levels had been administrative spaces, filled with empty tables and abandoned scrolls that crumbled to dust at a touch. But as they descended deeper into the fortress's heart, the architecture changed. The walls became older, cruder, carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. "Here," Galen whispered, stopping before a chamber whose entrance was marked with warnings in the black speech. "This is as far as our scouts dared venture." Thorin studied the ominous inscriptions, wishing Gandalf were present to translate them. But the wizard's urgency in recent weeks made more sense now. If he had known what dwelt here, if he had been involved in driving it out. "We press on," Thorin decided, "but carefully, and we retreat at the first sign of true danger." The chamber beyond was vast, its ceiling lost in shadows that their torchlight could not penetrate. At its center sat a throne carved from a single block of black stone, empty now, but still radiating an aura of malevolent power. Around it lay scattered papers and books, hastily abandoned, as if their owner had fled in great haste. "Look at this," Dwalin called softly from near the throne. He was holding a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with spidery writing in multiple languages. "Some of this is in the common tongue. Listen. The ring must be found. The precious must be reclaimed. Without it, the shadows cannot hold, cannot rebuild, cannot reclaim what was lost." Thorin felt a chill run down his spine. What ring? Thranduil had moved to examine other scattered documents, his immortal features growing increasingly pale. "This one speaks of Mount Doom," he said quietly. "And here, when the ring returns to its master, the fires of the earth shall serve the darkness, and no fortress of good shall stand against the shadow's advance." "The One Ring," whispered one of the memorial guard, a young dwarf named Nar, whose grandfather had fought in the War of the Last Alliance. "My grandfather spoke of it sometimes, the ring of power that Sauron forged in the fires of Mount Doom." Sauron. The name hung in the air like a curse, and suddenly everything made terrible sense. The necromancer had not been some lesser dark power, some mere sorcerer playing with shadows and fear. It had been the Dark Lord himself, returned from his defeat, and slowly rebuilding his strength in secret. "We need to search deeper," Thorin said, his voice steady, despite the fear gnawing at his heart. "If this knowledge exists, there may be more. Maps, plans, anything that might tell us where he's gone and what he intends." They descended further into the fortress's depths, following spiral staircases that seemed to wind down into the very roots of the mountain. The air grew colder with each step, and the oppressive weight of malice pressed down on them like a physical thing. In the deepest chamber they could find, carved from the living rock and lit by no torch or flame, Thorin's foot struck something that rang with the clear note of crystal. He knelt carefully, brushing away dust and debris, and uncovered a sphere of dark stone shot through with veins of silver. A palantir, one of the ancient seeing stones of Númenor. "Don't touch it," Thranduil warned urgently. "Those stones are perilous beyond measure. They were made to serve the wise, but in the wrong hands." But even as he spoke, Thorin found himself drawn to the stone, as if by some force beyond his will. This was what Sauron had used to communicate with his servants, to spy upon his enemies, to coordinate the vast network of evil that had been slowly spreading across Middle-earth. If there were answers to be found, they lay within its dark crystal depths. "I have to know," Thorin said quietly. "If he's planning something, if there's a threat coming to our people." He placed his hands on the smooth surface of the Palantir before anyone could stop him. The visions came in a rush that nearly drove him to his knees. Dark halls filled with forges and furnaces, armies of orcs marching in perfect formation, vast engines of war being constructed in the shadow of a burning mountain. And through it all, a presence so malevolent and powerful that Thorin's mind recoiled from direct contact. But in that brief moment of connection, he saw what mattered most: Mordor, the land of shadow where Sauron had retreated to rebuild his power. Mount Doom, where the fires of the earth served darker purposes than any dwarf smith had ever imagined. And underneath it all, a desperate hunger for something lost, something precious that would restore the Dark Lord's full strength: the ring. Always it came back to the ring. Thorin yanked his hands away from the Palantir with a gasp, his vision swimming and his heart hammering against his ribs. Around him, concerned voices called his name, but it took several moments for the real world to reassert itself over the visions of darkness and flame. "What did you see?" Thranduil asked urgently, his hand steady on Thorin's shoulders. "Mordor," Thorin managed, his voice hoarse. "He's returned to Mordor, and he's rebuilding his armies, preparing for war." He looked up at the Elven King with haunted eyes. "He seeks something called the One Ring. Without it, his power is limited. But if he finds it, then Middle-earth falls," Thranduil finished grimly. They gathered what documents they could carry and left Dol Guldur to its empty malice, riding hard through the forest toward Erebor, with news that would change everything. Behind them, the fortress stood like a monument to departed evil. But Thorin knew it was only a temporary absence. The darkness had not been destroyed, merely relocated, and somewhere in the world a ring of power waited to be found, by the forces of good, or by the enemy that would use it to destroy everything they held dear. The knowledge sat heavy in Thorin's heart as they rode through the night. He had survived the battle of 5 armies, had learned to bear the weight of his choices and find purpose in service rather than rule. But now a greater test approached, one that would require all his newfound wisdom and more besides. The war for Middle-earth was coming, whether they were ready or not. And this time, the stakes would be nothing less than the freedom of every living thing under the stars. When they finally reached Erebor's gates 3 days later, dusty and exhausted but alive, Thorin knew that everything had changed. The Palantir's visions burned in his memory like brands, and the documents they had recovered told a story of preparation and malice that chilled him to the bone. Dain was waiting for them in the great hall, his face grave with the weight of kingship and the burden of unwelcome news. But when Thorin told him what they had discovered in the depths of Dol Guldur, even the Iron Hill's stubborn courage seemed shaken. "Then we prepare for war," Dain said finally, his voice steady, but his eyes troubled. "And we pray that when it comes, we'll be ready for what the darkness brings." Thorin nodded, thinking of the visions still echoing in his mind. Somewhere in the world, an ancient evil was gathering its strength, and the fragile peace they had fought so hard to win was already beginning to crumble. The weight of survival had become the weight of responsibility, not just for his own people, but for all the free folk of Middle-earth, and whether he was strong enough to bear it remained to be seen. Chapter 5. The Council of 3 Kings. The great hall of Erebor had been transformed for the occasion, Its long table expanded to accommodate representatives from 3 kingdoms. Maps covered every available surface, marked with pins and colored thread to show trade routes, defensive positions, and the increasingly troubling reports that had prompted this gathering. Thorin stood beside one of the great windows, watching the delegates arrive, and tried to push down the unease that had been growing in his chest for days. The news had started as whispers, scattered reports from merchant caravans and travelling tinkers about increased dangers along the mountain passes. Then the reports had grown more frequent and more specific. Orc bands moving in coordinated groups, wolves hunting in packs larger than anyone had seen in living memory, travellers disappearing on roads that had been safe for generations. Now, 3 weeks after the expedition to Dol Guldur, the whispers had become a steady drumbeat of concern that could no longer be ignored. "Your Majesty," announced Glóin, who had taken on the role of Dain's herald since recovering from his wounds in the recent battle. "King Bard of Dale and Lord Thranduil of the Woodland Realm have arrived." Dain rose from his place at the head of the table, resplendent in the formal robes of his office, but still bearing the practical demeanor of a warrior king. "Welcome them in, and see that their guards are properly housed and fed." Bard entered first, his bearing more regal than it had been during the desperate days following Smaug's attack. The bowman-turned-king had grown into his role with surprising grace, and his practical approach to leadership had already begun to show results in Dale's reconstruction. Behind him came 2 of his chief advisors, men Thorin recognized from the negotiations following the Battle of 5 Armies. Thranduil arrived with his customary elegance, his silver robes unmarked by travel, despite the long journey through Mirkwood's increasingly hostile paths. The Elven King's ageless features showed no sign of the weariness that marked his mortal allies, but Thorin had learned to read the subtle signs of concern in the ancient lord's bearing. "My friends," Dain said formally, gesturing toward the chairs that had been prepared. "Please be seated. We have much to discuss." When everyone had settled around the great table, Thorin found himself occupying an interesting position. Not quite a king, not quite a subordinate, but something new that reflected his unique role in recent events. Dain had insisted he sit at the king's right hand, close enough to provide counsel, but clearly serving rather than ruling. "The reports speak for themselves," Bard began without preamble, spreading several documents on the table. "Orc raiders have struck 3 merchant convoys in the past month. The Carrack crossing was attacked by a force of at least 50 wolves, and yesterday—" He paused, his weathered face grim. "Yesterday we lost contact with the garrison at Ravenhill." Thorin felt his blood chill. Ravenhill was where Fili and Keeley had made their final stand, where so much blood had been spilled in the recent battle. If the orcs were bold enough to attack a fortified position so close to Erebor, "My scouts report similar activities along our borders," Thranduil added, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. "Creatures that fled deep into the forest during the battle have grown bold again. Dark things that should not exist walk openly in places where sunlight once reached the ground." Dain leaned forward, his iron-grey beard bristling with tension. "Coordinated attacks? That's what concerns me most," Bard replied. "These aren't random raids or desperate scavenging. Someone or something is organizing them, testing our defenses, probing for weaknesses." Thorin exchanged a meaningful look with Thranduil. They had not yet shared the full truth of what they had discovered in Dol Guldur, but the time for partial truths was clearly past. "There's something you both need to know," Thorin said carefully, "about our expedition to the abandoned fortress. We found more than empty halls and cold hearths." He told them everything, the scattered documents, the references to the One Ring, and most importantly, his brief but terrifying contact with the Palantir. Both leaders listened in grim silence as he described the visions of Mordor, the armies being assembled in shadow, and the desperate hunger for power that drove their ancient enemy. When he finished, the hall was quiet, except for the crackling of the great hearth and the distant sound of wind across the mountain peaks. Sauron, Bard said finally, the name heavy on his tongue. The Dark Lord of Mordor returned to strength. He was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. Then these raids aren't random at all. They're preparation for something larger. Much larger, Thranduil agreed. If what Thorin saw in the stone is true, then all our kingdoms are in greater danger than we realized. He turned his ancient gaze toward Dain. This changes everything. Dain nodded slowly. Then we need to change with it. The informal cooperation we've enjoyed since the battle, it's no longer sufficient. You're proposing a formal alliance? Bard asked. I'm proposing survival, Dain replied bluntly. 3 kingdoms, united in purpose and mutual defense, shared intelligence, coordinated responses, and enough trust between us to act as one when the storm finally breaks. The negotiations that followed were complex, but surprisingly swift. All 3 leaders understood the stakes, and the recent cooperation between their peoples had built a foundation of trust that made detailed terms easier to establish. They would share information about enemy movements, coordinate patrols along their borders, and come to each other's aid if any kingdom was threatened. Most importantly, they would establish a communication network that could rapidly spread news of danger across the entire region. Beacon fires on the high peaks, Thorin suggested, tracing potential lines of sight on the map spread before them. From the lonely mountain to the hills above Dale, from there to the heights of the woodland realm, a message could travel the entire circuit in a single night. And ravens for more detailed communications, Thranduil added. My people have long maintained a covenant with the great black birds. They are swift, intelligent, and their memories are longer than those of men. Bard studied the proposed network with the practical eye of a former soldier. It's ambitious, but if we're facing what you believe we're facing, ambition may be our only hope. They spent the better part of the morning working out details, which peaks would host beacon fires, how the Raven messengers would be trained and coordinated, what signals would indicate different levels of threat. It was detailed, tedious work, but necessary. When war came, and they all understood now that it was when, not if, their survival might depend on how quickly information could travel. There's another matter, Thorin said when the immediate plans were settled. One that may prove even more important in the long term. He moved to a larger map, one that showed not just their local region, but the broader expanse of Middle-earth. His finger traced a line south from their kingdoms toward the great cities of Gondor and Rohan. We're not the only ones who will face this threat. When Sauron moves openly, he'll strike at every free kingdom simultaneously. If we're going to survive, we need to coordinate not just among ourselves, but with all who stand against the darkness. The suggestion met with immediate resistance. The southern kingdoms are weeks away, Bard protested. By the time messengers could travel there and back, any crisis would be long resolved. And they have their own concerns, Thranduil added more diplomatically. Gondor's troubles with the corsairs of Umbar, Rohan's conflicts along their borders. They may view our problems as distant and unrelated to their own security. Dain was more blunt. You're asking us to entangle ourselves in conflicts that may have nothing to do with our own survival. I'm willing to stand with our neighbors and proven allies. I'm not willing to commit dwarf lives to distant wars that serve other people's interests. Thorin understood their reluctance, but the visions from the Palantir burned too clearly in his memory to let the matter drop entirely. I'm not asking for immediate commitment, only that we open communications, establish relationships that might prove valuable when the true test comes. Perhaps, Thranduil said thoughtfully, though I would suggest caution in how we approach such matters. The affairs of the great kingdoms are complex, and we are small powers in comparison. They were still debating the merits of broader alliances when a commotion outside the great hall interrupted their discussions. Voices raised in challenge and response, the sound of armed men moving quickly through the corridors. Dain was rising from his chair when the doors burst open to admit Dwalin, his face grim with urgency. "Your Majesty," the warrior said, inclining his head briefly to Dain before turning to the assembled council. "Forgive the interruption, but there's someone here you need to see. A ranger, he calls himself. Says he carries urgent news from the wild lands." The man who entered behind Dwalin was tall and lean, wearing the practical leathers and worn cloak of someone who lived rough in the wilderness. His dark hair was streaked with premature grey, and his eyes held the wariness of someone who had seen too much of the world's darkness. He moved with the careful grace of a trained warrior, but there was something about his bearing that suggested nobility beneath the ranger's garb. "My lords," the stranger said, inclining his head respectfully to each of the three rulers in turn. "I am Halbarad of the Dunedain. I come from the wild lands between here and the Misty Mountains, and I bear news that will not wait for proper protocol." "Speak freely," Dain said, gesturing for the man to step forward. "What news from the wilderness?" Halbarad's weathered face was grave as he replied, "The Nine are abroad again, my lords. The Nazgul ride the dark roads, and their presence spreads terror among all who dwell in remote places. 3 nights past, my kinsman and I tracked a company of black riders as they moved north along the old dwarf road. They were searching for something, or someone, with desperate urgency." The chill that ran down Thorin's spine had nothing to do with the mountain's stone halls. The Nine, the Nazgul, Sauron's most terrible servants, the ringwraiths who served the Dark Lord's will without question or mercy, if they were actively hunting in the north. "Searching for what?" Bard asked, though his tone suggested he suspected the answer would bring no comfort. "We could not determine that," Halbarad admitted, "but their path led them ever northward, toward the lands where rumors speak of a certain ring of power. They seek something precious, something that was lost and must be found again." Thranduil's ancient eyes widened slightly, the first crack in his immortal composure that Thorin had ever witnessed. The One Ring. They hunt for the One Ring. "So we believe," Halbarad confirmed, "which means that somewhere in these lands, the most dangerous artifact ever forged lies hidden. And if the enemy's servants find it before those who would defend the light," he didn't need to finish. They all understood the implications. If Sauron reclaimed his lost ring of power, no alliance of northern kingdoms would be sufficient to stand against him. The free peoples of Middle-earth would fall like wheat before the scythe. "Then we have even less time than we feared," Dain said grimly. "How long before the Nazgul reach our borders?" "Days," Halbarad replied. "Perhaps a week if they continue their methodical search. But they will come, my lords, and when they do, no stone will remain unturned in their hunt." The council session that followed was shorter and more focused than any of them had anticipated. Plans that had seemed ambitious moments before now felt barely adequate to the threat they faced. The beacon network was approved unanimously, with construction to begin immediately. Raven messengers would be trained and deployed within the fortnight. Border patrols would be doubled, and every settlement would be warned to report any sign of dark riders or unusual activity. Most importantly, they would share everything they knew about the ring and its significance, ensuring that no clue was overlooked and no opportunity missed to find it before their enemies did. "If this ring truly exists somewhere in our lands," Bard said as the formal session drew to a close, "we need to find it first. But carefully, quietly. If word spreads of what we're seeking, the hunt becomes a race," Thranduil finished, "and we cannot afford to lose such a contest." As the delegates prepared to return to their kingdoms with their new agreements and dark knowledge, Thorin found himself standing once again at the great window, looking out over the valley where so much blood had been spilled and so many hopes had been tested. The Northern Alliance was born, forged not from ambition or conquest, but from the simple need to survive what was coming. Whether it would prove strong enough remained to be seen. But for the first time since the visions in the Palantir, Thorin felt something like hope. They were no longer facing the darkness alone. Whatever came, they would meet it together. 3 kingdoms united in purpose, bound by shared danger and the determination to protect what they had built from the ashes of war. The weight of survival had become the weight of alliance, and perhaps that would prove to be enough. But as reports continued to arrive of shadows growing longer and dangers multiplying in the wild places of the world, Thorin knew their greatest trials still lay ahead. The storm was coming, but at least now they would face it as one. Chapter 6. The Dwarf Lord's Dilemma. The journey to the Iron Hills took 4 days through mountain passes that had remained unchanged for centuries, carved by dwarf hands in ages past, and maintained by dwarf pride ever since. Thorin rode at the head of a small company, just enough guards to show proper respect, not so many as to suggest conquest or threat. Behind him, Balin sat his pony with the easy grace of long experience, while a handful of the memorial guard provided a practical escort through country that had grown less safe in recent weeks. The hills themselves rose like iron spears from the earth, their peaks crowned with the smoke of countless forges, and their slopes honeycombed with tunnels that ran deeper than any surface dweller could imagine. This was the heart of dwarf-kind's strength in the north, not just Dain's people, but dozens of smaller clans and settlements that had made their homes in the mineral-rich mountains. "Nervous?" Balin asked, as they approached the great gates of the primary settlement, his weathered face showing the kind of gentle concern that had made him invaluable as an advisor for so many years. Thorin considered the question as he studied the massive ironwork ahead of them, decorated with the hammers and anvils that marked this as a place where dwarf craft reached its highest expression. "Hopeful," he said finally, but not particularly confident. The problem was simple enough to state, if not to solve. The scattered dwarf clans had survived for generations by keeping their own counsel and trusting to their mountain strongholds for protection. It was a strategy that had served them well through countless conflicts with orcs and goblins, through the rise and fall of distant kingdoms, through wars that had shaken the foundations of Middle-earth. But the threat rising in the east was different, larger, more coordinated, and backed by a malevolent intelligence that would not be deterred by stone walls or iron gates. Convincing his people to abandon the habits of centuries would require more than royal authority or battle-won prestige. It would require trust, and trust had always been a commodity in short supply among the independent-minded dwarf lords. The reception hall where the clan leaders had gathered was carved from a single enormous geode, its walls lined with crystals that caught and reflected the torchlight in patterns that seemed almost alive. 7 lords had answered Dain's summons, representing settlements from the Grey Mountains to the foothills of the Misty Mountains. Each sat behind a table, bearing the symbols of his house, and each watched Thorin with expressions that ranged from respectful attention to barely concealed skepticism. "Lord Thorin," said Fundin the Elder, his voice carrying the weight of his 93 years and the authority of one who had led his people through 3 separate orc invasions. "We are honored by your presence, though I confess some surprise at the urgency of your message. The troubles you describe, are they truly so pressing as to require this gathering?" Thorin had expected that question, and he'd spent the journey preparing his answer. "My Lord Fundin, 3 months ago, I would have asked the same question. The affairs of distant kingdoms seemed remote from our mountain halls, and the idea that some ancient evil could threaten our well-defended homes would have struck me as the stuff of children's tales." He moved to the center of the circle, where a large map had been spread on a table of polished stone. With practiced movements, he began placing markers: red stones for confirmed orc sightings, black stones for attacks on settlements, silver stones for the locations of dwarf communities. "But the evidence has a way of changing one's perspective," he continued. 3 coordinated attacks on the trade routes between our settlements in the past month. Ravenhill overrun by creatures that should have fled into the deep places after our victory. And most troubling of all, the Nazgul, the 9, riding openly through lands that have known peace for decades. Young Gnarly, lord of a prosperous mining settlement near the Grey Mountains, leaned forward with interest. "You speak of the ring wraiths as fact, not legend." "Because they are fact," Thorin replied grimly. "I have spoken with those who have seen them, tracked their movements, witnessed the terror they leave in their wake. They hunt for something in our lands, something that could give their master power beyond anything we can imagine." The debate that followed was heated but respectful, conducted with the formal courtesy that dwarf tradition demanded, but infused with genuine concern for the future of their people. The older lords, Fundin, Telchar, and Borin the Stonefoot, argued for traditional defensive strategies: strengthen the gates, deepen the tunnels, prepare for siege warfare as their ancestors had done for countless generations. The younger lords, Gnarly, Keem, and Floy, were more open to Thorin's warnings, but their questions focused on practical concerns. How could scattered dwarf settlements coordinate their defenses across such vast distances? What proof was there that the threat was real enough to justify abandoning the isolation that had kept them safe for so long? "You ask for proof," Thorin said when the initial arguments had been laid out. "Let me share with you what I learned in the depths of Dol Guldur." He told them everything: the Palantir, the visions of Mordor, the armies being assembled in shadow for purposes that would bring ruin to all free peoples. When he described what he had seen in the Seeing Stone, the reception hall grew quiet enough that the only sounds were the distant ringing of hammers and the soft hiss of torch flames. "The Dark Lord has returned," Thorin concluded, "not as rumor or distant threat, but as immediate reality. His servants already move among us, and when he strikes in earnest, no mountain stronghold will stand alone against the tide of darkness he brings." Balin, who had remained silent through the debate, finally spoke from his place at Thorin's side. "I was with Thorin when we returned from Dol Guldur," the old dwarf said, his voice carrying the authority of long friendship and shared danger. "I saw his face when he touched that accursed stone, saw what the visions cost him. Whatever else you may think of this proposal, know that it comes from one who has looked into the heart of our enemy's stronghold and lived to warn us of what he found there." The testimony seemed to carry weight with the assembled lords, particularly Telchar, whose own grandfather had fought in the War of the Last Alliance and passed down stories of Sauron's malice that had shaped 3 generations of his family. "Assuming the threat is real," Telchar said carefully, "what exactly are you proposing we do about it? Our settlements are days apart, our forces scattered across hundreds of miles of mountain country. Even if we agreed to coordinate our defenses, the practical challenges would be enormous." Thorin had been waiting for exactly this question. From his travel pack, he withdrew a leather tube that contained maps older than any in the hall, charts and diagrams that had belonged to his grandfather Thror, inherited from his grandfather before him, passed down through generations of dwarf kings. "Our ancestors faced similar challenges," he said, unrolling the first map with careful reverence. "During the War of the Last Alliance, when the forces of darkness last threatened to overwhelm the free peoples, the dwarf lords of that time established a network of signals and supply lines that allowed rapid communication and mutual support across vast distances. The map showed the Iron Hills and surrounding regions, but marked with symbols that were unfamiliar to most of those present. Signal towers on strategic peaks, cache points where supplies could be stored and messengers could find fresh mounts, rally points where scattered forces could gather in times of crisis. Most of these installations were abandoned after the war," Thorin continued, tracing the ancient routes with his finger. "But the sites remain, and the principles behind them are as sound now as they were then. With relatively modest investment from each settlement, we could re-establish a communications network that would allow us to respond to threats as a unified force rather than isolated targets." Gnarly studied the map with obvious fascination. "The signal tower here, on the peak above our settlement. We always wondered why our ancestors chose to build there. The forge placement seems inefficient, but for communication. Perfect line of sight to 3 other settlements and the main pass through the Grey Mountains," Thorin confirmed. "Your ancestors weren't just miners and smiths. They were strategic thinkers who understood that sometimes the best defense is the ability to call for help." The discussion that followed was more technical than philosophical, focused on practical details rather than grand strategy. How many dwarves would each settlement contribute to manning the signal stations? What supplies would be cached at each rally point? How would messages be coded to prevent enemy interception? What authority would coordinate responses to threats that crossed clan boundaries? It was, Thorin realized, exactly the kind of detailed planning that dwarves excelled at. Give them a problem with concrete dimensions and practical solutions, and they would work through every aspect with the same methodical care they brought to crafting fine weapons or engineering complex tunnel systems. "There's another consideration," Floy said, as the evening wore on and the maps became increasingly marked with proposed improvements and additions. "The younger generation. My own sons have been restless these past years, eager for adventures beyond the boundaries of our traditional territories. This kind of coordinated defense would give them purpose and training while serving a genuine need." "Aye," agreed Keem, nodding vigorously. "Too many of our young ones are leaving the mountains entirely, seeking their fortunes in the cities of men or the courts of elves. If we could offer them meaningful service to their own people." Fundin, who had been listening to the younger lords with increasing thoughtfulness, finally spoke again. "You're talking about more than defensive coordination. You're talking about a fundamental change in how our people relate to the wider world." "Yes," Thorin said simply. "Because the world has changed, whether we change with it or not. The ancient enemy has returned, and the old strategies of isolation and individual strength will not be sufficient to meet the threat he represents." The formal vote, when it came near midnight, was closer than Thorin had hoped, but sufficient for his purposes. 4 of the 7 lords agreed to participate in the renewed alliance: Nali, Kim, Floy, and after a long moment of consideration, Telchar. Fundin and Borin chose to maintain their traditional defensive postures, though they agreed to share intelligence about threats and to consider requests for aid on a case-by-case basis. The 7th Lord, Thrar of the Westgate settlements, asked for time to consult with his own council before committing to either course. It wasn't unanimous support, but it was enough to begin building the network that might prove crucial when the real test came. As the lords prepared to return to their homes with agreements to formalize and preparations to begin, Thorin felt a mixture of satisfaction and apprehension. They had taken a significant step toward meeting the coming storm as a united people. Whether it would prove sufficient remained to be seen. The journey back to Erebor gave him time to reflect on what had been accomplished and what challenges remained. The dwarf lords who had joined the renewed alliance controlled perhaps half the military strength of the scattered clans, and their territories covered most of the strategic passes through the Iron Hills and Grey Mountains. But the other half remained uncommitted, clinging to the isolation that had served them well in the past. Worried? Balin asked, as they rode through the same passes they had travelled 4 days earlier, now under skies that seemed darker and more threatening than before. Thorin considered the question as he studied the peaks around them, wondering how many held watchers loyal to the cause they had just advanced, and how many remained neutral in the growing struggle between light and shadow. "Hopeful," he said finally, echoing his earlier response, but with genuine conviction this time. Not entirely satisfied, but hopeful. We've planted seeds that may grow into something strong enough to weather what's coming. Behind them, riders were already spreading out to carry word of the new alliance to settlements across the region. The Iron Alliance, they had named it, binding together the strength of the mountain clans in common cause for the first time since the War of the Last Alliance. Signal fires would soon burn on ancient peaks, and young dwarves would take up the mantles their ancestors had worn in defense of all free peoples. It was a beginning. Whether it would prove to be enough remained to be written in the annals of war, and the choices yet to be made. But for the first time since the visions in the Palantir had shown him the scope of the threat they faced, Thorin felt that his people might be ready to meet their destiny with honor and hope intact. The weight of survival had become the weight of leadership, not just for Erebor, but for all the scattered children of Durin who called the mountains home. And perhaps that responsibility, shared among many rather than borne by one, would prove strong enough to endure whatever darkness the future might bring. Chapter 7. The Shadow Lengthens. 5 years had passed since the Palantir had shown Thorin the truth of their enemy's return, and in that time the northern kingdoms had grown accustomed to the rhythms of watchful peace. The beacon towers stood manned and ready on their appointed peaks, the raven messengers flew their routes with clockwork precision, and the young warriors of the Memorial Guard had grown into seasoned veterans through countless patrols and training exercises. It was almost possible to believe that the preparations had been unnecessary, that the darkness in the east had found other concerns to occupy its malevolent attention. Then the merchant caravan from the Blue Mountains failed to arrive at Erebor's gates. Thorin stood on the battlements in the pale light of dawn, studying the empty road that wound through the valley below. The caravan had been expected 3 days ago, dwarves from the western settlements carrying worked goods to trade for the superior metals and gems of the lonely mountain. Such delays were not uncommon. Weather, road conditions, or simple mechanical problems could slow even the most experienced travelers, but the raven that should have brought word of the delay had never arrived, and that silence spoke louder than any message could have. "Still nothing from the western watchtowers?" he asked Dwalin, who had joined him on the wall with 2 cups of strong morning tea and the grim expression that had become increasingly common in recent weeks. "Nothing," Dwalin confirmed, handing over one of the cups. "The beacon fires have been dark for 6 days now. Either the watchposts have been abandoned, or—" He didn't finish the thought. But then he didn't need to. They both understood what silence meant in these troubled times. The response force that rode out from Erebor an hour later was larger than Thorin would have preferred, but smaller than Dain had wanted to send. 40 warriors from the Memorial Guard and the regular garrison, mounted on sturdy ponies and equipped for swift movement rather than prolonged siege. If they found nothing but mechanical trouble or weather delays, the force would be sufficient to provide assistance. If they found something worse, it would be large enough to fight clear and bring word back to the mountain. The road to the Blue Mountains had been peaceful for years, a well-maintained route that carried the bulk of trade between the scattered dwarf settlements. Now it felt different, not obviously dangerous, but somehow watchful, as if unseen eyes tracked their progress from the shadows of the surrounding hills. The first real sign of trouble came 20 miles from Erebor, where they found the remains of a way station that had been burned to its stone foundations. Recently, reported Nar, the young dwarf who had grown into one of Thorin's most reliable scouts. The ashes are still warm in places, and the bodies— He gestured toward several dark shapes that had once been the station's guards. No more than 2 days, I'd say. Thorin dismounted and moved carefully through the ruins, reading the signs of violence that told their own grim story. The attack had been swift and overwhelming, orc work, judging by the crude weapons left behind and the particular savagery of the destruction. But there was something different about this raid, something more purposeful than the random acts of banditry they had grown accustomed to fighting. They took the horses, Dwalin observed, examining the empty stable, and the supplies, but left the trade goods behind. He gestured toward scattered bolts of cloth and broken pottery that represented considerable value. What kind of raiders ignore loot? The kind that weren't raiding for profit, Thorin realized with growing unease. The kind that had specific objectives beyond simple destruction and theft. The kind that were testing something. They found the missing caravan 12 miles further west, in a narrow defile where the road passed between 2 steep hills. The wagons had been overturned and burned, their contents scattered across the rocky ground like the debris of some terrible storm. But this time, there were signs of organized resistance, defensive positions among the rocks, evidence of a fighting withdrawal, and most tellingly, the bodies of nearly 24 orcs mixed among the fallen dwarves. They fought well, Thorin said quietly, kneeling beside the body of a dwarf he recognized from previous trade delegations. Oin the Younger, barely past his majority, but already known for his skill at working silver. Better than the odds should have allowed. Aye, agreed Dwalin grimly, but not well enough. The trail of the attacking force led north from the ambush site toward the wild lands that bordered the Iron Hills. Thorin followed it for several miles before calling a halt, his unease growing with each hoofprint and broken branch they discovered. The orcs had numbered at least 60, moving in disciplined formation rather than the loose mob typical of most raiding parties. More troubling still, their trail showed signs of coordination with other groups, meeting points where different bands had converged, supply caches that suggested advanced planning. This wasn't random violence or opportunistic banditry. This was reconnaissance in force, probing the defenses of the northern kingdoms with the methodical care of a military operation. The beacon fire that night blazed from the peak of Ravenhill, carrying its coded message across the valley to Erebor's signal tower and from there to the far-flung watchers of the Alliance network. Enemy forces active, caravan destroyed, strength at least 60, requesting reinforcement and guidance. The response came with the dawn, not just acknowledgement from Erebor, but urgent signals from the eastern settlements, and a message carried by Raven from the woodland realm that made Thorin's blood run cold. Multiple attacks. The elegant script of Thranduil's herald was usually flowing and measured, but these words showed signs of haste that spoke of genuine crisis. Dol Guldur, reoccupied by dark forces. Eastern borders under assault. Request immediate aid under terms of alliance. The ride back to Erebor took less than half the time of their outward journey, driven by urgency that made both ponies and riders push themselves to the edge of endurance. They found the mountain in a state of controlled chaos, with warriors assembling in the great courtyard, while ravens arrived and departed in a constant stream of messages that painted an increasingly dark picture of coordinated attacks across the entire region. "How bad?" Thorin asked, as he swung down from his exhausted mount, accepting the situation report that Dain's aide thrust into his hands. "Bad enough," Dain replied grimly, gesturing toward the maps that covered his planning table. 7 confirmed attacks along the trade routes, 3 beacon towers overrun, and if Thranduil's reports are accurate, there's something much worse stirring in the ruins of Dol Guldur. The council of war that followed was brief and focused, driven by the knowledge that their enemies would not wait for lengthy deliberations. The Iron Alliance had proven its worth. Warning signals had given the scattered settlements time to prepare their defenses, and coordinated responses had prevented several attacks from achieving their objectives. But the scope of the assault was larger than anyone had anticipated, and it was becoming clear that their preparations, thorough as they had been, might not be sufficient for the threat they now faced. "The pattern is clear enough," Thorin said, studying the marked locations on the regional map. "They're cutting the trade routes, isolating our settlements from each other and from potential sources of aid. Classic siege tactics, but applied on a scale that covers hundreds of miles. And the timing is no coincidence," added Balin, who had spent the day correlating reports from across the region. Every attack began within hours of each other, despite being spread across territory that would take weeks to cross on foot. This level of coordination suggests the Nazgul, Thorin finished. "Sauron's captains have returned to Dol Guldur, just as we feared they would." He turned to Dain, his expression grave. "Thranduil's request for aid isn't just about honoring our alliance. If Dol Guldur becomes a permanent stronghold of the enemy again, none of our other defenses will matter." The force that marched east from Erebor 3 days later was the largest army the mountain had fielded since the Battle of 5 Armies. 200 dwarf warriors, equipped with the finest weapons and armor the forges could provide, supported by supply trains that could keep them in the field for weeks if necessary. At their head rode Thorin and Dwalin, leading the memorial guard and the pick of Dain's regular troops toward whatever darkness had taken root in the shadow of Mirkwood. They were joined along the way by contingents from the Iron Alliance, young dwarves eager to test their training against real enemies, veterans who remembered the stories of Sauron's malice from their grandfathers, and a few grizzled warriors old enough to have fought in the War of the Last Alliance themselves. By the time they reached the borders of the Woodland Realm, their force had grown to nearly 300, representing the largest military cooperation between dwarf clans in living memory. The elves who met them at the border were haggard in a way that Thorin had never seen before, their usual immortal composure cracked by weeks of constant vigilance and mounting losses. Captain Galion, whom Thorin remembered from previous diplomatic meetings, looked as though he had aged decades in the few years since they had last met. "Lord Thorin," Galion said, inclining his head with obvious relief, "King Thranduil awaits you at the forward command post. The situation—" He paused, searching for words. "The situation has deteriorated significantly since our last message." The forward command post was a fortified position carved from the living trees of Mirkwood itself, its defenses blending so seamlessly with the forest that they were almost invisible until one was among them. Here, Thranduil had gathered the remnants of his border guard and what allies he could muster, wood elves, men of Lake Town, and even a few eagles who had answered the call for aid. "My friend," Thranduil said, as Thorin approached the central pavilion, his usual perfect composure showing stress fractures around the edges. "I cannot express how grateful I am for your swift response. The enemy's assault has been more savage and coordinated than anything we have faced since the dark years of the Second Age." The battle map that dominated the pavilion told a story of systematic devastation. The ruins of Dol Guldur had indeed been reoccupied, but not by the scattered servants who had fled during the White Council's attack years before. This was a full military installation, complete with siege engines, supply lines, and what appeared to be a standing army of orcs and worse things that had emerged from the fortress's ancient depths. "The Nazgul?" Thorin asked, though the black markers placed around the fortress already told him the answer. "3 of them at least," Thranduil confirmed. "They arrived a month ago and immediately began organizing the scattered orc tribes into something resembling a proper army. Since then, our losses." He gestured toward casualty reports that painted a grim picture of elvish companies destroyed, outposts overrun, and trade routes cut by enemy forces that seemed to anticipate every defensive move. "How long can you hold without reinforcement?" Thorin asked. "Days, perhaps," Thranduil replied honestly. "Weeks if we fall back to our deepest defenses. But every day we delay allows them to strengthen their position and extend their influence further into the surrounding lands." Thorin studied the map in silence, weighing options and calculating odds with the experience of 5 years as a marshal and the hard-won wisdom of his near death at the Battle of 5 Armies. The fortress was strong, the enemy was numerous, and the tactical situation favored the defenders. A direct assault would be costly at best, suicidal at worst. But the alternative, allowing Dol Guldur to become a permanent base for enemy operations in the heart of the northern lands, was unacceptable. "We attack," he said finally, "but not directly, and not alone. The alliance we've built over these past years, it's time to test whether it's strong enough to bear the weight of real war." The battle that began 3 days later would be remembered as the first major engagement of what would later be called the War of the Ring's Northern Theatre. The combined forces of dwarf and elf, man and eagle, struck at Dol Guldur from 3 directions simultaneously, coordinating their assault with a precision that would have been impossible without the communication networks and joint training exercises of the previous 5 years. Thorin led the main assault force directly against the fortress's heavily defended gates, drawing the attention of the enemy's strongest units, while Thranduil's elves struck at the supply lines, and Bard's men secured the approaches. It was bloody work, carried out under skies darkened by the smoke of burning siege engines and the shadows cast by creatures that should not have existed in any world meant for the living. But when the sun set on the 3rd day of fighting, the banners of the Northern Alliance flew over the shattered ruins of Dol Guldur, and the enemy forces that had not been destroyed in the assault were fleeing eastward toward whatever dark holes had spawned them. The victory came at a price. Nearly 1/3 of the Allied force lay dead or wounded among the fortress's broken walls, and the Nazgul themselves had escaped to spread word of the Alliance's strength to their master in Mordor. But for the first time since the darkness had begun to stir again in the east, the forces of good had struck a significant blow against their ancient enemy. As Thorin stood among the ruins where he had first glimpsed the scope of Sauron's malice, watching his allies tend their wounded and count their losses, he felt a mixture of pride and apprehension that had become familiar over the years. They had proven that the Alliance could fight, could win against significant odds when united in purpose. But they had also revealed their strength to an enemy who would undoubtedly plan his next moves with their capabilities in mind. The shadow was lengthening across Middle-earth, and this first victory was only the beginning of a struggle that would test every bond they had forged and every preparation they had made. The weight of survival had become the weight of war, and whether their alliance could bear that burden remained to be proven in battles yet to come. But tonight, at least, the darkness had been driven back, and the beacon fires that blazed across the northern lands carried a message of hope as well as warning. The Northern Alliance stood ready, and their enemies would find no easy conquest in the lands they had sworn to defend. Chapter 8. The Ring-Bearers Return. The guard who brought word to Thorin's study was out of breath from running up the mountain's many stairs, his eyes wide with something between surprise and disbelief. "Marshal," he gasped, struggling to maintain the proper courtesy due his station while clearly bursting with urgent news. "There are travelers at the gates, a hobbit and a wizard, asking for audience with King Dain and specifically requesting to see you, my lord." Thorin set down the supply reports he had been reviewing, tedious but necessary work in the aftermath of the Dol Guldur campaign, and felt his heart skip strangely in his chest. A hobbit and a wizard. After 17 years, it could only mean... "Bilbo?" he asked, though he already knew the answer from the guard's expression. "Aye, my lord. Says his name is Baggins, and he carries a staff letter from Gandalf the Grey, requesting immediate counsel on matters of great urgency to all free peoples." The guard swallowed hard, clearly struggling to remember the exact words. "The wizard looks grim, Marshal. Grimmer than I've ever seen any of the wise folk look." Thorin was already moving, straightening his formal robes and checking that Orcrist hung properly at his side. Whatever brought Bilbo back to Erebor after all these years, whatever news Gandalf carried that required such urgency, it would not be pleasant tidings. The wizard had visited the mountain only twice since the Battle of 5 Armies, both times bearing warnings about the growing shadow in the east that had proven all too accurate. "Send word to King Dain immediately," Thorin instructed, as they made their way through Erebor's corridors towards the main gates. "Tell him we have guests of significant importance, and request his presence in the Great Hall at his earliest convenience. And have someone prepare the guest quarters in the royal wing, proper accommodations for a hobbit, and whatever the wizard requires." The great courtyard was bustling with the usual activity of early afternoon: merchants conducting business, craftsmen moving materials, guards changing shifts. But Thorin's attention was immediately drawn to the 2 figures standing near the gates, travel-stained and weary but unmistakably familiar, despite the passage of years. Bilbo had aged, though not as much as 17 years should have warranted. His hair was greyer and his face more lined, but there was something about his bearing that suggested the weight of years had touched him more lightly than it should have. He wore practical travelling clothes rather than his old waistcoat and breeches, and his pack looked as though it had seen hard use on dangerous roads. Beside him stood Gandalf, and the wizard's appearance gave Thorin genuine concern. The grey pilgrim looked older than Thorin had ever seen him, his usually bright eyes shadowed with worry, and his staff held not with casual authority, but with the grip of someone who expected to need its strength at any moment. "My dear Thorin!" Bilbo called as soon as he spotted the dwarf approaching, his voice carrying genuine warmth despite whatever urgency had brought him here. "You look well. More than well, actually. The years of peace have been kind to you." "As they have been to you, old friend," Thorin replied, clasping Bilbo's hand with both of his own. The hobbit felt solid and real beneath his grip, but there was something unsettling about his appearance that Thorin couldn't quite identify. "Though I suspect this is not a social visit." "Indeed it is not," Gandalf said, his voice carrying none of the usual warmth that marked his greetings. "We must speak with you immediately, Thorin, and with King Dain as well. The matter we bring concerns not just Erebor, but all the northern kingdoms, indeed, all of Middle-earth." "Then come," Thorin said, gesturing toward the mountain's depths. Dain is being summoned even now, and we can speak freely in the Great Hall. As they made their way through Erebor's corridors, Thorin found himself studying his friend more closely. Something was different about Bilbo, beyond the simple passage of years. A restlessness in his movements, a tendency to touch his pocket repeatedly, a way of glancing over his shoulder as if expecting pursuit. When Thorin caught his eye directly, there was something in the hobbit's gaze that hadn't been there before. A mixture of sorrow and determination that spoke of terrible knowledge carried too long in silence. Dain was already waiting when they reached the Great Hall, flanked by his advisors and wearing the formal robes that indicated he understood the gravity of the situation. The king's iron-grey beard had grown fuller over the years, and his face bore the lines that came with the weight of crown and the constant vigilance required to protect his people. But his eyes were as sharp as ever. "Master Baggins," Dain said formally, inclining his head with the respect due an honored ally. "Gandalf, you are welcome in the halls of Erebor, though I suspect your news may be less welcome than your presence." "Your Majesty speaks truly," Gandalf replied, settling heavily into the chair that had been provided for him. "What we bring is news that will change everything, not just for your kingdom, but for all who value freedom and light in this world." The wizard paused, seeming to gather himself for whatever revelation he was about to share. When he continued, his voice was heavy with the weight of terrible certainty. 17 years ago, when our company departed from these halls after the Battle of 5 Armies, Master Baggins carried with him what he believed to be a simple magic ring, a trinket found by chance in the goblin tunnels beneath the Misty Mountains. I myself thought little of it at the time, assuming it to be one of the lesser rings of power, possibly elvish work from the Second Age. Bilbo's hand moved again to his pocket, a gesture so unconscious and repeated that Thorin suddenly understood what he had been observing. The hobbit was checking constantly for something precious, something that had become so much a part of him that its absence would be immediately noticed. "I was wrong," Gandalf continued, his words falling into the great hall like stones into still water. "Grievously, catastrophically wrong. The ring that Master Baggins has carried all these years is not some minor magical artifact. It is the One Ring of Sauron, the ring of power that the Dark Lord forged in the fires of Mount Doom to control all other rings and dominate all free peoples." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant sound of hammers from Erebor's forges and the whisper of air through the vast stone chambers. Thorin felt the words settle into his understanding, like pieces of a puzzle suddenly clicking into place, explaining so much that had puzzled him over the years. "The One Ring," he said quietly. "The ring we found mentioned in the documents at Dol Guldur, the prize that Sauron seeks above all others." "The same," Gandalf confirmed grimly. "For years I have researched, consulted ancient texts, sought the counsel of the wise. The evidence is undeniable. Every test I have been able to perform, every sign and portent, confirms what I had hoped never to discover." Dain leaned forward in his throne, his expression troubled. "And Master Baggins has carried this thing unknowingly for 17 years? "Not entirely unknowingly," Bilbo said quietly, speaking for the first time since they had entered the hall. His voice was steady, but carried an undertone of exhaustion that went deeper than mere physical weariness. "I began to suspect years ago that my ring was more than it seemed. The way it preserved me from aging, the way dark creatures seemed drawn to places where I had used it. The dreams." He shuddered slightly. The dreams that whispered of fire and domination, and a great eye searching always, always searching. "Why did you not seek help earlier?" Thorin asked gently. Because I was afraid, Bilbo admitted. Afraid of losing the ring. Afraid of what the knowledge might mean. Afraid that the very act of speaking of it might somehow alert our enemies to its location. He looked around the assembled company with haunted eyes. I might have carried that fear to my grave, but Gandalf found me 3 months ago and shared his conclusions. The choice was taken from me. And now? Dain asked. What does this mean for our defenses, our preparations? Gandalf's expression grew even grimmer, if such a thing were possible. It means that everything we have done, every alliance forged, and every defense prepared has been built on incomplete understanding. Sauron's recent attacks, his growing boldness, his systematic probing of your defenses, all of it has been in service of one goal: finding the ring and reclaiming it. The Nazgul we faced at Dol Guldur, Thorin said, understanding flooding through him. They weren't just testing our military strength, they were searching. Among other things, yes, Gandalf confirmed. And now that our victory has demonstrated the northern kingdoms pose a genuine threat to his plans, Sauron will focus his efforts more intensely. The ring's presence in these lands makes every person here a target, every settlement a potential battlefield. Then we defend it, Dain said immediately, his warriors' instincts asserting themselves. We gather our allies, strengthen our defenses, and protect Master Baggins and his burden until what? Bilbo interrupted, his voice carrying a note of desperation. Until Sauron brings all his armies to your doorstep. Until he turns the full weight of his malice on this mountain and everyone in it. He shook his head firmly. I cannot allow that. I will not be the cause of Erebor's destruction. The ring cannot remain here, Gandalf agreed, nor can it remain anywhere in the northern kingdoms. Its very presence is a beacon to our enemies, and no fortress built by mortal hands can stand against the full might of Mordor, focused on a single goal. Then what do you propose? Thorin asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer, and dreaded it. The ring must be destroyed, Gandalf said simply. It is the only way to end Sauron's threat permanently and ensure the safety of all free peoples. And there is only one place in all Middle-earth where it can be unmade, the fires of Mount Doom, where it was forged. The debate that followed was heated and desperate, driven by the terrible mathematics of an impossible choice. To attempt the destruction of the ring would require a journey into the heart of enemy territory, carrying the very thing Sauron desired most directly into his reach. The chances of success were minimal, and the cost of failure would be the immediate victory of darkness over all the world. But to keep the ring, to try to hide or defend it, would only delay the inevitable while giving Sauron time to marshal his full strength against them. Sooner or later, the ring would be found, or taken, and when that happened, no power in Middle-earth would be able to stand against the Dark Lord's complete dominion. There must be another way, Dain insisted. Some means of hiding the ring beyond Sauron's reach, or using its power against him. The ring cannot be used by any save its master, Gandalf said firmly. That was the trap Sauron built into its making. It will ultimately betray any who attempt to wield it, turning them to his service, regardless of their initial intentions. As for hiding it, he shook his head. Sauron's power grows daily, and his reach extends further with each passing year. No hiding place in Middle-earth will remain secret forever. Then someone must carry it to Mount Doom, Thorin said quietly. Someone must attempt what seems impossible, because the alternative is certain defeat. I will go, Bilbo said immediately. It is my burden, my responsibility. I have carried it this long. I can carry it a little further. No, Thorin said firmly, rising from his chair. "You have done enough, my friend. More than enough. If this journey must be made, let it be by someone younger, stronger, better suited for the task." "Who?" Bilbo challenged. "Who else understands the ring as I do? Who else has carried it and felt its weight, its constant whisper of temptation? Who else can be trusted to resist its corruption long enough to see it destroyed?" The questions hung in the air unanswered, because they all knew the truth of what Bilbo said. The ring was not just a physical object to be transported. It was a trap, a snare for the mind and spirit that would grow stronger the closer it came to its place of origin. Whoever carried it would need not just physical courage, but spiritual strength beyond the reach of most mortals. "If you go," Thorin said finally, "you will not go alone. Whatever escort you require, whatever support we can provide, it will be yours." "A small company," Bilbo said thoughtfully. "Large enough to provide protection, small enough to move quickly and avoid detection. And—" He hesitated, then continued with obvious reluctance, "and provisions for the possibility that none of us will return from this journey." As the evening wore on and plans began to take shape around the terrible necessity they faced, Thorin found himself thinking of all the years since the Battle of 5 Armies, the alliances forged, the preparations made, the victories won. All of it had led to this moment, this choice between certain doom and desperate hope. The weight of survival had become the weight of the ring itself, and the knowledge that their greatest test still lay ahead in the fires of Mount Doom. But as he looked at Bilbo, still determined to bear his burden to whatever end awaited, and at the gathering of allies willing to support him in that dark journey, Thorin felt something like the hope he had carried on that ridge 17 years ago, when a hobbit's courage had saved his life. They would face the darkness together, as they always had. And perhaps, against all odds and expectations, that would prove to be enough. Chapter 9. The Path to Mount Doom. The war council that convened the following morning in Erebor's great hall was unlike any that had been held in the mountain's long history. Maps of Middle-earth covered every surface, from the detailed charts of the northern kingdoms to ancient drawings of Mordor's approaches that had been gathered from archives and lore masters across the region. Representatives from the Northern Alliance sat alongside dwarf lords of the Iron Alliance, while ravens brought word from distant allies, and beacon fires carried messages to settlements throughout the realm. At the center of it all sat the simple truth that had transformed everything. The One Ring must be destroyed, and Mount Doom was the only place in all Middle-earth where such destruction was possible. "The mathematics are stark," Gandalf said, his staff planted firmly beside his chair as he addressed the assembled leaders. "Sauron's power grows with each passing day. His armies multiply in the shadow of the Black Mountains. His influence spreads through the wild places of the world, and his servants search ever more desperately for the ring they know exists somewhere beyond his reach." Dain leaned forward in his throne, his weathered face grave with the weight of decisions that would determine the fate of kingdoms. How long before he focuses his full attention on the northern lands? "Not long," Gandalf replied grimly. "Our victory at Dol Guldur proved that the northern kingdoms possess both the strength and the will to resist his expansion. He will not allow such opposition to remain when the ring's recovery is so close at hand." The wizard's ancient eyes swept the assembled council. "I estimate we have perhaps a year before he moves in force against these lands, less if his spies discover the ring's true location." "Then we strike first," Thorin said, rising from his place at the council table. The years as Dain's marshal had taught him to think in terms of campaigns and logistics, and his mind was already working through the possibilities. We gather every warrior the Alliance can muster, march on Mordor while Sauron is still rebuilding his strength, and fight our way to Mount Doom by force of arms. The proposal sent a ripple of murmurs through the great hall, some approving, others skeptical. Bard, who had arrived from Dale during the night, studied the maps with the practical eye of someone who had led men in desperate battles. The Black Gate alone would require a siege, he said thoughtfully, and that's assuming we could march an army across hundreds of miles of enemy territory without being destroyed piecemeal. He traced potential routes on the largest map, his finger following paths that led through increasingly dangerous lands. We could field perhaps 5,000 warriors from all our allied kingdoms combined, against Sauron's full strength. It would be suicide, Thranduil said bluntly. The Elven King had arrived with the dawn, his usual perfect composure showing strain around the edges. My people have memories of the last alliance, when the combined might of elves and men could barely prevail against the enemy's forces. What we could muster now would be a fraction of that strength, facing a foe who has had decades to prepare his defenses. Perhaps, Thorin acknowledged, but the alternative is to wait while he grows stronger, and our position grows more desperate. If we're going to lose anyway, better to lose while striking a blow that might achieve something. There is another way, Bilbo said, quietly from his place at the table. The hobbit had been silent through most of the military discussion, but now all eyes turned to him. A way that doesn't require armies or sieges or direct confrontation with forces we cannot match. Gandalf nodded slowly, understanding where the hobbit's thoughts were leading. Secrecy, stealth, a small company that could slip past Sauron's watchers while his attention is focused elsewhere. Exactly, Bilbo said, gaining confidence as he spoke. Sauron expects attack from strength, armies marching under banners, sieges of his fortresses, the kind of warfare he understands and has prepared for. He does not expect a few travelers walking quietly through his back door. Dain's expression was skeptical. A few travelers against all the power of Mordor? How would such a small force hope to reach Mount Doom, much less survive the journey back? They wouldn't, Bilbo said simply. At least they couldn't plan on surviving. This would be a mission with one purpose: destroy the ring, whatever the cost to those who carry it. The blunt honesty of the statement settled over the council like a shroud. They had all understood intellectually that the ring's destruction might require sacrifice, but hearing it stated so plainly drove the reality home in a way that abstract planning could not. "You're talking about a suicide mission," Thorin said, his voice tight with emotion he was struggling to control. "I'm talking about the only mission that has a real chance of success," Bilbo corrected gently. "Thorin, you've seen Sauron's stronghold through the Palantir. You know the strength of his defenses, the size of his armies. No force we could muster would fight its way to the heart of Mordor and back, but a small company, moving quietly, might slip through where an army would be destroyed." Thorin closed his eyes, calling up the memories he had tried to push away for years. The visions from the Seeing Stone had shown him Mordor in all its terrible glory. The vast fortresses, the armies of orcs and darker things, the network of watchtowers and patrols that guarded every approach to the Black Land. Against such defenses, even the combined strength of all the northern kingdoms would be like waves breaking against an unscalable cliff. "The stealth approach has merit," he admitted reluctantly, "but it leaves the ring-bearer completely unprotected if the plan goes wrong. If Bilbo is captured, if the company is discovered, then Sauron wins," Bilbo said matter-of-factly. But he also wins if we try to fight our way through his armies and fail. At least this way, there's a chance, small but real, that the mission might succeed. The debate that followed was intense and emotional, driven by the terrible weight of choosing between bad options in service of a desperate hope. The military commanders naturally favored the direct approach, trusting in strength of arms and the proven valor of their warriors. The more subtle minds at the council saw the wisdom in stealth, but struggled with the idea of sending friends to almost certain death without the protection of armies. There is, perhaps, a middle path, Gandalf said, when the arguments had reached their peak intensity. Not stealth or strength, but both, used in coordination to maximize our chances of success. He moved to the great map, pointing to locations that had featured in their previous discussions. A small fellowship carries the ring toward Mordor by the most secret paths available. Meanwhile, our armies march openly toward the Black Gate, drawing Sauron's attention and forcing him to concentrate his defenses in the wrong direction. Thorin studied the proposal, his military mind working through the implications. A diversion. Make Sauron believe the ring is with our army, while the real bearers approach from an unexpected direction. Precisely, Gandalf confirmed. The army would not be expected to win. Indeed, it could not win against Sauron's full strength, but it could buy time, create confusion, and most importantly, keep the enemy's focus away from the true threat until it was too late to respond. A diversion force that would be completely destroyed once Sauron realized the deception, Bard said grimly. Almost certainly, Gandalf agreed. Unless the ring were destroyed quickly enough to rob Sauron of his power before he could complete the army's destruction. The council fell silent as the full implications of the plan became clear. They were discussing not one desperate mission, but two, the secret fellowship that would carry hope into the heart of darkness, and the army that would march knowingly toward destruction to give that hope its only chance. I'll lead the diversion, Thorin said, without hesitation. It's the perfect use of everything we've built over these years, the alliances, the communication networks, the joint training. One last great campaign for the Northern Alliance. Thorin, no, Bilbo protested immediately. You don't need to. Someone needs to command the armies, Thorin interrupted gently. Someone who understands both the military situation and the true stakes involved. Someone whose presence will convince Sauron that the northern kingdoms are making their greatest effort. He met his friend's eyes steadily. I've been preparing for this role my entire life, Bilbo. Let me use that preparation for something that matters. Dain studied his cousin and Marshal with troubled eyes. The likelihood of survival is irrelevant, Thorin said firmly. We're not planning for survival anymore. We're planning for success, whatever that costs. He turned to address the full council. How long would the Fellowship need to reach Mount Doom if they left immediately? Months, Gandalf replied after a moment's calculation. The safe paths are not the swift paths, and the ring-bearer will face increasing difficulty as they approach their goal. I would estimate 3 to 4 months minimum, assuming no major delays or disasters. Then we have 3 months to prepare the largest military force the northern lands have ever assembled, Thorin said, his voice taking on the authority that had served him through years of successful campaigns. Every warrior the alliances can muster, every supply line we can establish, every piece of intelligence we can gather about Mordor's defenses. It will take time to coordinate such a massive effort, Bard warned. Gathering forces from across the region, establishing supply chains, planning the march. Then we start immediately, Thorin replied. Send out the call to every ally, every settlement, every warrior who has sworn oath to our cause. This is what we've been building toward. Whether we knew it or not, The moment when everything we've accomplished either proves sufficient or fails utterly. The planning session that followed extended well into the evening, with messengers departing every few hours to carry word to distant kingdoms and Raven Masters working continuously to coordinate responses from across the Alliance network. By the time the Council finally adjourned, the basic framework was in place. Bilbo would lead a fellowship of no more than 8 or 9 companions, chosen for their stealth and endurance, rather than their fighting strength. Meanwhile, Thorin would gather the largest army possible and march openly toward Mordor, making enough noise and showing enough strength to convince Sauron that the northern kingdoms were attempting a direct assault. It was a plan born of desperation and courage in equal measure, one that required both parts to succeed for either to have meaning. But as Thorin stood on Erebor's battlements that night, looking out over the valley where so much had changed since that desperate battle, he felt something like the peace that comes with accepting one's destiny. The weight of survival had become the weight of sacrifice, not just his own, but that of thousands who would march behind his banner into certain destruction. It was a heavier burden than any crown, but also a cleaner one. For the first time since the dragon sickness had clouded his judgment, Thorin knew exactly what he was fighting for, and why it was worth any price. Below in the mountain's depths, Bilbo was making his own preparations for a journey that would take him far from the gentle comforts of the Shire, and into darkness that no hobbit was meant to face. But both of them understood now that their friendship had always been leading toward this moment, the burglar and the king, each carrying their portion of the burden that would determine the fate of all free peoples. Tomorrow, the work of gathering armies would begin in earnest. Tonight, there was only the weight of choices made, and the knowledge that everything they had built together, the alliances, the victories, the hard-won wisdom of years, would soon be tested in the fires of Mount Doom and the fields of battle before the Black Gate. The shadow was lengthening across Middle-earth, but for the first time since the Palantir had shown him the scope of their enemy's malice, Thorin felt that they might have found a path through the darkness. Whether it would prove sufficient remained to be written in the annals of war and the choices yet to be made by those brave enough to walk the hardest roads. But they would walk them together, as they always had, even when the paths diverged and led to different destinations. The weight of friendship, Thorin reflected, as he made his way back into Erebor's protective halls, was perhaps the heaviest burden of all, and the only one that made all the others bearable. Chapter 10. The Battle of Dale. The first assault came with the dawn of the spring equinox, when the shadows were longest and the morning mist hung thick over the valley floor. From his command post on the walls of Dale, Thorin watched as the darkness between the trees began to move, resolving itself into endless ranks of orcs and worse things that poured from the corrupted depths of Mirkwood like a black tide. The enemy host stretched from horizon to horizon, larger than anything seen in the north since the last alliance, and at its head rode shapes cloaked in shadow that made even veteran warriors step back from the walls in instinctive fear. "Signal the mountain," Thorin commanded, his voice carrying clearly over the organized chaos of final preparations. 3 long blasts, maximum alert, and get word to Thranduil that they're coming from the southwest as well as the east. The horn call that echoed from Dale's walls was answered immediately by the deep boom of Erebor's war horn, and within moments the beacon fires were blazing on every peak from the lonely mountain to the borders of the woodland realm. 17 years of careful preparation and alliance building had led to this moment, the ultimate test of whether the northern kingdoms could stand together against the full fury of the Dark Lord's malice. Below in the valley, The enemy host was arranging itself with the methodical precision that spoke of intelligent command. Orc battalions formed into attacking columns, while siege engines were wheeled forward under the protection of massive shields. Wargs prowled the flanks in packs too large to count, and overhead the screech of fell beasts announced the presence of Nazgul among the army's leadership. But most terrible of all were the trolls, dozens of them, each standing twice the height of a man, and armored with plates of black iron that would turn aside any ordinary blade. They carried weapons that looked more like siege engines than tools of war, and their presence among the front ranks spoke of Sauron's determination to crush the northern resistance once and for all. "How many?" asked Dain, who had ridden down from Erebor with the mountain's full garrison to take his place in the battle line. 10,000, perhaps more," Thorin replied, lowering his spyglass with hands that remained remarkably steady. "Including at least 3 companies of trolls and support from the Nazgul." He gestured toward the enemy formations. "This isn't a raid or a probing attack. This is everything Sauron can spare from his southern campaigns, sent to eliminate the northern threat permanently." The defense of Dale had been planned for months, ever since the decision to provide a diversion for Bilbo's mission had been made. The town's walls had been strengthened and heightened, its gates reinforced with iron and dwarf work, its towers equipped with engines of war that could strike at enemies still hundreds of yards away. The surrounding terrain had been prepared as well, bridges destroyed or weakened to channel enemy movement, supply caches positioned to support defensive fallback positions, and killing fields cleared where the defenders' superior training and equipment could offset the enemy's overwhelming numbers. Most importantly, the combined army of the Northern Alliance was ready. 5,000 warriors from Erebor, Dale, and the woodland realm stood shoulder to shoulder on the walls and in the streets, their formations integrated through years of joint training and their communications coordinated through signal systems that had been tested in a dozen smaller battles. The Iron Alliance had contributed another 2,000 fighters from the scattered dwarf settlements, while contingents from Esgaroth and the outlying communities brought the total defensive force to nearly 8,000. It should have been enough to hold a fortified position against any reasonable assault. Against what was advancing toward them across the valley floor, it would have to be enough, because there was nowhere left to retreat. "Positions!" Thorin called as the enemy host began its advance. "Remember the drill. Disciplined fire until they reach the killing ground, then withdrawal by sections to the secondary positions. Make them pay for every yard." The first exchange of missile fire began when the orcs were still half a mile from the walls. Dale's ballista opened with a coordinated volley that struck down the enemy's standard bearers and scattered the front ranks, while teams of elven archers targeted the fell beasts circling overhead. The response was immediate and overwhelming, thousands of black arrows darkening the sky, followed by great stones hurled from orc catapults, and the acrid smoke of incendiary devices that burst against the walls in gouts of green flame. But the defenders had prepared for this as well. Shield formations protected the wall's defenders, while teams of volunteers doused the fires before they could spread. Counter-battery fire from the town's artillery targeted the enemy siege engines, and flights of arrows from the Memorial Guard's archers struck down orc commanders faster than they could be replaced. For the first hour, it seemed as though the defense might hold indefinitely. The enemy paid a terrible price for each advance, and their casualties mounted faster than their commanders could maintain order in the ranks. But Thorin had fought enough battles to recognize the signs when the tide began to turn against them. The trolls were the key. Too heavily armored to be stopped by ordinary weapons, too large to be halted by the obstacles that channeled smaller enemies. They advanced steadily through the killing fields, while the orcs used them as mobile cover. When they reached the walls, Their great hammers began to tell against stone and mortar that had stood for centuries. "Fall back to the second line," Thorin commanded, as the first breach opened in the outer defences. "Fighting withdrawal. Make them come through the gaps in single file." The retreat was orderly at first, each section of the wall evacuated according to plan, while rear guards held the critical points long enough for their comrades to reach the next defensive position. But as more breaches opened and the enemy pressure intensified, the withdrawal began to take on the characteristics of a rout, despite the officers' best efforts to maintain control. By noon, the defenders had been pushed back to Dale's inner walls, and by evening they were fighting in the streets themselves. House by house, intersection by intersection, the Northern Alliance traded ground for time while the enemy's superior numbers began to tell. The casualty reports that reached Thorin throughout the long day painted a grim picture of companies reduced to scattered squads and formations that existed more on paper than on the increasingly chaotic battlefield. It was then, as the sun began to set behind the peaks of the lonely mountain and shadows lengthened across the blood-soaked streets of Dale, that the horns of Rohan echoed across the valley. They came from the south in a thunder of hoofbeats that made the ground shake. 600 riders under the banner of King Theoden, their spears bright in the dying light, and their voices raised in the ancient battle songs of the Rohirrim. At their head rode Erkenbrand of Westfold, his sword already red with orc blood from battles fought along the way, his face grim with the knowledge that this might be their last charge. "Reinforcements!" someone shouted from the walls, and the cry was taken up by voices hoarse with battle rage and desperate hope. The riders are come!" The charge that followed would be remembered in song for as long as men dwelt in the northern lands. 600 horsemen striking the orc army's flank like a thunderbolt, their long spears punching through the enemy formations, and their horses trampling the broken ranks underfoot. Behind them came the reorganized defenders of Dale, sallying forth from gates that had been sealed since morning and striking at an enemy suddenly caught between hammer and anvil. But even as the immediate crisis passed and the orc assault began to falter, Thorin knew the battle was far from over. This was only the first day of what would certainly be a longer siege, and the enemy still commanded overwhelming numerical superiority. Unless something changed dramatically in their favor, the defenders would eventually be ground down by sheer attrition. The change came on the second day, announced by the great eagles that had answered the call of their ancient friendship with the dwarves. Gwaihir the Windlord led his people in a diving attack against the Nazgul, engaging the fell beasts in aerial combat that raged above the battlefield, while their earth-bound allies fought for control of Dale's ruins. The sight of the great birds locked in mortal combat with Sauron's most terrible servants sent a thrill of hope through the defending army. Here were allies whose aid had been hoped for, but never promised, coming to their help in the darkest hour. More importantly, the eagles brought news from the wider world. Gondor's armies were engaged along the Anduin, Rohan's full strength was marching to war, and across Middle-earth the free peoples were rising in coordinated resistance to Sauron's final bid for dominion. The northern battle was part of a larger war, and the defenders were not fighting alone. "How goes the southern campaign?" Thorin asked Gwaihir during a brief respite when the great eagle alighted on Dale's highest tower. "Hard fought, but not lost," the Eagle Lord replied in his stern, clear voice. "The enemy's attention is divided between many fronts, and his servants struggle to coordinate responses across such vast distances. Your battle here serves its purpose. Sauron fears what strength the northern kingdoms might bring to bear if left unmolested." "And the other matter?" Thorin asked carefully, mindful that even allies might have ears that could carry word to enemies. Progresses, Gwaihir said simply. The small folk are closer to their goal than they were, though the path grows ever more perilous. He studied Thorin with eyes that held the wisdom of centuries. Hold fast, son of Thrain. The hour is dark, but it is not yet the final hour. The third day brought the crisis that would determine the battle's outcome. The enemy had regrouped during the night, bringing forward their heaviest siege engines and coordinating a synchronized assault against every section of Dale's remaining defenses. Trolls hammered at the gates, while orc sappers worked to undermine the walls, and overhead the Nazgul pressed their attack against the eagles with renewed fury. It was Thorin himself who led the sortie that broke the enemy's final assault. Taking the memorial guard and 2 companies of dwarf veterans, he struck directly at the siege engines that were battering Dale's main gate, fighting through the orc guards with the desperate valor of warriors who knew that failure meant the doom of everything they held dear. The battle around the great catapults was hand-to-hand and savage, dwarf axes against orc scimitars in a whirling melee that left the ground soaked with blood from both sides. But the defenders' superior training and equipment began to tell as the fight continued, and one by one the great engines fell silent under the blows of dwarf hammers and the flames of incendiary devices. As the sun set on the third day, the surviving orc army began its retreat toward the corrupted depths of Mirkwood, their assault broken and their losses too heavy to sustain. The Northern Alliance had held, barely, at terrible cost, but they had held. The diversion had succeeded, buying precious time for whatever mission was unfolding in the distant south, while proving to Sauron that the northern kingdoms could not be dismissed or ignored. The cost of victory was written in the casualty reports that arrived throughout the following days. Nearly half the defending army lay dead or wounded in Dale's streets and on the walls of Erebor. Entire companies of the Memorial Guard had been wiped out in the fighting, and some of the dwarf settlements of the Iron Alliance had lost a generation of their finest warriors. The Rohirrim had paid their own price in blood, and even the great eagles mourned comrades who had fallen in the aerial battles above the town. But they had won. Against odds that should have been overwhelming, fighting an enemy that had never known defeat in open battle, the Northern Alliance had proven that the free peoples could stand against the darkness and prevail. More than that, they had bought time for whatever desperate hope was playing out in the south, time for Sauron to question his assumptions about where the real threat lay, time for the light to find some way to triumph over the shadow. As Thorin stood among the ruins of Dale's outer wall, watching the funeral pyres burn for the fallen and the healers tend to the wounded, he felt the weight of command settle on his shoulders like a familiar cloak. They had done what needed to be done, paid the price that victory demanded, and proven that the bonds forged in peace could hold fast in the crucible of war. The shadow had tested them and found them strong. Whether that strength would prove sufficient for whatever trials still lay ahead remained to be seen. But tonight, at least, the beacon fires of the northern kingdoms burned bright against the darkness, and the free peoples had shown that they would not go gently into whatever night awaited them. The weight of survival had become the weight of victory, hard won and dearly bought, but real nonetheless. And in the distance, somewhere beyond the horizon, a hobbit and his companions carried the ultimate hope of all Middle-earth toward a destiny that would determine whether such victories had any meaning at all. But that was tomorrow's burden. Tonight, the Northern Alliance stood victorious on the field of battle, their enemies scattered, and their cause proven just. It would have to be enough, because it was all they had to give, and everything they had fought for hung in the balance of choices yet to be made by others in places far from the blood-soaked streets of Dale. The war was not over, but tonight, for the first time in months, It felt as though it might be winnable. Chapter 11. The Hour of Victory. The moment came without warning, as the most profound changes in history often do. Thorin was standing in the ruins of Dale's eastern gate, directing the distribution of supplies to the wounded and organizing the pursuit of the scattered orc forces, when the sky above the distant southern mountains suddenly blazed with a light that had nothing to do with the setting sun. A pillar of fire rose from beyond the horizon, climbing toward the heavens like the breath of some impossibly vast forge, and with it came a sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. For a heartbeat, every warrior on the battlefield, dwarf and man and elf alike, stopped what they were doing and stared in wonderment at the distant conflagration. Then understanding began to dawn, spreading through the ranks like wildfire as veterans of previous campaigns recognized what they were witnessing. "Mount Doom," breathed Dwalin, who had fought his way to Thorin's side through the chaos of the pursuit. "That's Mount Doom burning." The effect on the enemy forces was immediate and absolute. Orcs who had been fighting with desperate savagery moments before suddenly threw down their weapons and fled, their harsh voices raised in wails of terror that echoed across the valley. Trolls that had required dozens of warriors to bring down collapsed where they stood, as if the will that animated them had simply vanished. Even the fell beasts overhead began falling from the sky, their riders' control broken by whatever catastrophe was unfolding in the distant south. "The ring," Thorin said quietly, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and desperate hope. "Bilbo did it. He actually did it." The victory that followed was unlike anything in the military histories of the northern kingdoms. There was no final charge, no dramatic last stand, no moment when superior tactics or courage turned the tide of battle. Instead, there was simply the sudden collapse of enemy resistance as Sauron's will failed and his servants found themselves abandoned by the dark power that had driven them to war. The orcs who had not fled immediately began surrendering in droves, their leaders dead or disappeared, and their formations dissolving into terrified mobs that sought only escape from a battlefield that had suddenly become incomprehensible to them. The few who continued to fight were isolated individuals or small groups, driven more by fear and confusion than by any coherent tactical purpose. "Pursue, but show mercy to any who yield," Thorin commanded, as the Northern Alliance forces organized themselves for what should have been a long and bloody chase through the wilderness. "This day has seen enough killing. Let those who wish to flee go back to whatever dark holes spawned them, but hunt down any who might threaten our settlements." The pursuit that followed was more a matter of mopping up than true military action. Most of the surviving orcs were more interested in reaching the safety of deep caves and abandoned fortresses than in continuing a war their master could no longer wage. Those few who resisted were quickly overwhelmed by forces whose morale had been transformed from desperate determination into jubilant triumph. By nightfall, the battlefield around Dale was quiet, except for the sounds of celebration and the more somber business of caring for the wounded. Victory fires blazed from every tower and wall, while messengers rode hard along the roads and beacon signals flashed from peak to peak, carrying the news to every settlement in the Alliance network. The dark tide that had threatened to engulf the northern kingdoms had broken and retreated, leaving behind only the detritus of war and the beginning of peace. But even in the midst of celebration, Thorin's thoughts were focused on a question that overshadowed all others. What had become of Bilbo and his companions? The destruction of the ring was clear enough. The evidence burned in the southern sky, and in the sudden collapse of enemy resistance everywhere. But the fate of those who had carried that terrible burden into the heart of darkness remained unknown. and might remain so for days or weeks to come. "Send out the fastest riders," Thorin instructed his captains, as the initial chaos of victory began to give way to more organized celebration. "Follow the road toward Mordor, and find whatever news they can of our friends. Spare no effort and no expense. I want to know what happened to the Fellowship." The riders who departed Dale that night carried with them not just official dispatches, but the hopes and fears of an entire army. Bilbo Baggins had become something more than just a friend to those who had fought in the Northern Campaign. He was the symbol of the courage and sacrifice that had made victory possible, the proof that even the smallest person could change the course of history when the need was great enough. As the hours passed and no word came from the south, Thorin found himself pacing the battlements of Dale like a caged wolf, unable to settle into the business of organizing the aftermath of battle while such crucial questions remained unanswered. The victory celebration that erupted spontaneously throughout the town felt hollow to him, premature until he knew the full cost of what they had achieved. It was Dain who finally cornered him in the early hours of the morning, when the victory fires had burned low and most of the army was sleeping off their first night of peace in months. "Cousin," the king said gently, settling beside Thorin on a broken section of wall that offered a view of the road south. "You'll wear a hole in the stones with all that pacing. The news will come when it comes, and your fretting won't bring it any faster." "I know," Thorin replied, though he made no move to stop scanning the empty road for signs of returning messengers. "But Bilbo, he's been part of this from the very beginning. If he didn't survive to see what his courage accomplished, then he died for the greatest cause any warrior could ask for," Dain said firmly. "The freedom of all free peoples, the end of a darkness that has threatened the world for an age. There are worse deaths, cousin." "Perhaps," Thorin agreed, "but there are better lives, and he deserved the chance to live one." The answer came with the third dawn after the battle, brought by a raven bearing the insignia of the Rangers and a message that had been relayed through a chain of signal stations stretching across hundreds of miles of wild country. The bird was exhausted from its long flight, barely able to maintain altitude as it settled on Dale's highest tower, but the scroll tied to its leg contained the news that Thorin had been desperate to hear. "The bearer lives," he read aloud to the assembled staff officers, his voice thick with emotion he made no effort to conceal. "The quest is complete, the ring is destroyed, and the bearer lives, though he bears wounds that may never fully heal. Fellowship scattered, but mostly intact. Returning by slow stages through Rohan and Gondor. Full report to follow." The cheer that went up from the officers echoed through the streets of Dale and across to the walls of Erebor, spreading like wildfire until every warrior in the Northern Alliance knew that their sacrifice had not been in vain. Bilbo Baggins lived. The ring was destroyed. The war was won, and the free peoples had triumphed over the darkness that had threatened to engulf them all. The victory feast that followed lasted 3 days and 3 nights, with delegations arriving from across the northern lands to celebrate the end of the greatest threat Middle-earth had ever faced. The Great Hall of Erebor, restored to its full glory for the first time since the dragon's occupation, rang with songs and speeches that would be remembered for generations. Lords and warriors who had fought together in desperate battles shared tables with farmers and craftsmen who had supported them from afar, all united in the joy of survival and the promise of peace. But even in the midst of celebration, Thorin found his thoughts turning to the cost of what they had achieved. The casualty reports made for grim reading. Nearly 4,000 dead from the Northern Alliance alone, with thousands more wounded who would bear the scars of war for the rest of their lives. Entire communities had been devastated by the conflict, and the work of rebuilding would take years or even decades to complete. On the final night of the feast, when the formal ceremonies had concluded and most of the delegates had departed for their homes, Thorin stood once again on the battlements of Dale and contemplated the future that stretched ahead. The immediate threat was over. The armies were disbanded, and the business of peacetime reconstruction was beginning. But the world had been changed by the events of recent years, and the relationships forged in war would need to be maintained and strengthened in peace if the victory was to have lasting meaning. "Regrets?" asked Thranduil, who had joined him on the walls with the silent grace that marked his elvish nature. The woodland king looked older than he had before the war, as if the constant vigilance and loss had worn away some of the immortal composure that usually marked his kind. "Many," Thorin replied honestly. "For those who died, for opportunities missed, for words spoken in anger that can never be taken back." He gestured toward the valley below, where the scars of battle were already beginning to fade under the work of determined hands. But not for the choice to fight. Whatever the cost, it was worth paying to see this day. "The young ones will not understand," Thranduil said thoughtfully. "Those who grow up in the peace we have bought will take it for granted, assume it was inevitable. They will not know how close we came to losing everything." "Then we'll tell them," Thorin said firmly. "The Memorial Guard was founded to preserve the memory of those who fell in the 5 Armies battle. Perhaps it's time to expand that mission, to ensure that the memory of this war and its lessons is preserved for those who come after." "A noble purpose," Thranduil agreed, "though I hope it will be generations before such knowledge is needed again." As the 2 kings stood in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead and the first hint of dawn touch the eastern peaks, Thorin reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. From exile and dragon sickness to redemption and wisdom, from a failed quest for gold to a successful defense of everything that truly mattered. It had been a long and often painful road, but one that had ultimately led him to exactly where he needed to be. The weight of survival had become the weight of victory, and now it was becoming the weight of responsibility for the peace that victory had purchased. It was a burden he was prepared to bear, supported by the friendships and alliances that had proven their strength in war and would hopefully prove equally strong in the challenges of peace. Somewhere to the south, Bilbo Baggins was making his slow way home to the Shire, carrying with him the satisfaction of a quest completed and a burden finally lifted. The thought of their eventual reunion filled Thorin with anticipation, for there would be much to discuss and plans to make for the years ahead. But that was tomorrow's work. Tonight, the Northern Kingdom slept peacefully for the first time in years, protected by the sacrifice of heroes and the strength of alliances that had proved themselves in the crucible of war. The shadow had lifted, the darkness had been driven back, and the free peoples had shown that they would not go quietly into any night that threatened their freedom. It was enough. It was more than enough. And for the first time since that desperate ridge where Bilbo's courage had saved his life, Thorin Oakenshield felt that he could rest with a clear conscience and hope in his heart for whatever the future might bring. Chapter 12. The King's Peace. The journey to Minas Tirith took 3 weeks through lands that were slowly healing from the wounds of war. Thorin rode at the head of a small delegation from the Northern Alliance, their banners bright in the spring sunshine as they followed roads that had been cleared of danger for the first time in a generation. Behind them came gifts worthy of kings, mithril mail wrought by the finest smiths of Erebor, gems from the deep places of the earth, and weapons that would serve faithfully for centuries to come. But the greatest gift they carried was less tangible, the formal recognition of the alliance that had proven itself in the crucible of war, and the promise of cooperation that would bind North and South together in the age of peace that was dawning. The White City rose before them like a dream made manifest in stone and crystal, its 7 circles ascending toward the citadel, where the banners of the returned king flew proudly in the wind. Thorin had seen Minas Tirith once before, many years ago, when he was still young and foolish enough to believe that glory could be measured in gold and conquest. Now, with the wisdom that came from survival and service, he saw it differently, not as a rival to be envied, but as an ally to be cherished, a symbol of the enduring strength that the free peoples could achieve when they stood together. The coronation of King Elisar was magnificent beyond anything Thorin had witnessed, even in the restored halls of Erebor. Representatives from every free kingdom in Middle-earth had gathered to witness the return of Isildur's heir to the throne of his fathers, and the ceremony itself combined the ancient traditions of Gondor with elements drawn from all the peoples who had contributed to the final victory over darkness. "My lords of the Northern Alliance," Aragorn said, when the formal presentations began, his voice carrying clearly through the great courtyard where the assembled dignitaries had gathered. "Your valor in the late war has proven that the strength of the free peoples lies not in any single kingdom, but in the bonds of friendship and mutual aid that unite us all in common cause." The recognition that followed was more than ceremonial courtesy. It was a formal acknowledgement of the Northern Alliance as a sovereign entity in its own right, with full rights to participate in the councils and decisions that would shape Middle-earth's future. The trade agreements that were signed, the mutual defense pacts that were renewed, and the cultural exchanges that were established would ensure that the cooperation forged in war would continue and strengthen in peace. "Well done, Marshal," Dain said quietly, as they stood together during the evening feast, watching the great lords of South and North mingling freely for the first time in centuries. "Your grandfather would be proud to see the treaties his grandson has helped to negotiate." Thorin smiled, thinking of Thror and the maps that had proved so crucial in establishing the Iron Alliance. "I think he would be more surprised than proud. The old ways of thinking about dwarf independence served their purpose, but this is something new, something better, perhaps." The return journey to Erebor took them through lands that were visibly prospering as the fruits of peace began to show. Merchant caravans moved freely along roads that had been death traps just months before. Settlements that had been abandoned during the war were being rebuilt and resettled. Most importantly, the people they met, human, elf, and dwarf alike, carried themselves with the confidence that came from knowing they lived in a world where cooperation had triumphed over division. But even in the midst of such hopeful signs, Thorin found his thoughts troubled by news that had reached him in Minas Tirith. Bilbo had returned to the Shire as planned, but his experiences as ring-bearer had left marks that went deeper than mere physical wounds. According to Gandalf, who had visited the northern kingdoms during Thorin's absence, the hobbit was contemplating a journey that would take him beyond the circles of the world, sailing west with the elves to the Undying Lands, where the hurts of mortality could finally be healed. The thought of such a final parting filled Thorin with a melancholy that even the triumphs of the coronation could not dispel. Bilbo had been present at every crucial moment of his life since that night in Bag End, when adventure had first come calling. To lose that friendship now, when they had survived so much together, seemed an unnecessarily cruel end to a story that should have concluded with peace and contentment for all involved. He found Bilbo in the gardens of Rivendell, where the hobbit was staying while making his final preparations for the journey west. The years had touched his friend more heavily than Thorin had expected, not just the natural aging that came with advanced years, but the deeper weariness that marked those who had borne burdens too great for mortal shoulders to carry. "My dear Thorin," Bilbo said, rising from the stone bench where he had been sitting in contemplation of the valley below. "I was hoping you would come. There are things I wanted to say before I go where you cannot follow." "Must you go?" Thorin asked, settling beside his friend with the careful movements of one who had learned to respect the weight of years and old wounds. "Surely the hurts you carry could heal here, among friends who understand what you've endured." Bilbo was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the distant peaks that marked the edge of the world they both knew. When he spoke, his voice carried a sadness that went deeper than mere physical pain. "The ring is destroyed, but it marked me before it was unmade," he said quietly. "In my dreams, I still feel its weight, still hear its whispers. Time moves strangely for me now. Sometimes I feel as though I'm still in that dark tunnel under the mountain, groping for something precious that I've lost. Other times, I feel older than the hills, weighed down by memories that belong to someone else." "Then let me help you carry that weight," Thorin said earnestly. "We've shared burdens before, my friend. This should be no different." "But it is different," Bilbo replied with a sad smile. "This is not a burden that can be shared or lightened by friendship, dear as that friendship is to me. The Valar have offered healing beyond what can be found in Middle-earth, and I find myself more ready for that gift than I expected to be." They spent the afternoon together, walking the paths of Rivendell and sharing memories of their years together. The desperate journey to Erebor, the triumph of the Battle of 5 Armies, the long years of building alliances and preparing for the war that had seemed inevitable. There was laughter mixed with the sadness, joy in recounting the moments when their friendship had proven strong enough to overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. But as evening approached, and the time for final farewells drew near, both of them understood that this conversation was an ending rather than a beginning. Whatever the future might hold for either of them, they would face it apart rather than together. "I want you to know," Bilbo said, as they stood together at the edge of the valley, watching the sun set behind the mountains, "that every choice you made, every stand you took, every moment when you chose wisdom over pride, it all mattered. You saved more than just your own life on that ridge 17 years ago. You saved the hope of all Middle-earth. We saved it together," Thorin corrected gently. "Your courage made everything else possible." "Perhaps," Bilbo agreed. "But you made something beautiful from the possibility. The Northern Alliance, the Iron Alliance, the peace we've won. None of that would exist if you hadn't learned to see beyond the walls of your mountain fortress." The ship that carried Bilbo west sailed on the evening tide 3 days later, bearing with it not just a tired hobbit, but also Gandalf and several of the greatest elves of Middle-earth. Thorin stood on the grey shores and watched until the white vessel disappeared beyond the horizon, carrying his dearest friend to whatever peace awaited beyond the circles of the world. The years that followed were marked by prosperity and growth unlike anything the northern lands had known since the Elder Days. The trade routes that connected Erebor to Dale, the Iron Hills to the Woodland Realm, and all of them to the great cities of the south, carried more than just goods. They carried ideas, innovations, and the growing understanding that cooperation produced greater wealth than competition ever could. Thorin threw himself into the work of building this new world with the same determination he had once applied to war. The Memorial Guard was expanded and formalized, becoming not just an elite military unit, but also a repository of knowledge and wisdom for future generations. Young warriors from across the Alliance came to train in Erebor's halls, learning not just the arts of war, but also the principles of diplomacy and cooperation that had made victory possible. The beacon network that had served them so well in battle was repurposed for peaceful communication, carrying news of harvest festivals and trade negotiations as readily as it had once carried warnings of enemy movement. The Raven messengers, their services no longer needed for military intelligence, found new purpose in maintaining the cultural and familial connections that bound the scattered communities of the Alliance together. Most importantly, the bonds forged in war proved strong enough to endure the challenges of peace. Disputes arose, as they always did when different peoples tried to live and work together, but they were resolved through negotiation and compromise rather than force. The precedents established in those early years of the Fourth Age would shape diplomatic relations for generations to come. As Thorin aged, more slowly than his mortal allies, but with the same inevitable progression toward wisdom that marked all who lived long enough to see their world change, he found himself increasingly called upon to serve as an elder statesman and counselor. Kings and princes sought his advice on matters ranging from military strategy to trade policy, recognizing in him the rare combination of practical experience and hard-won wisdom that only came from surviving the kind of trials he had endured. On his 100th birthday, still young by dwarf standards, but old enough to provide perspective on a lifetime of change, Thorin stood once again on the battlements of Dale and contemplated the transformation that had taken place since that desperate battle so many years before. The town below bustled with commerce and culture, its streets filled with the children and grandchildren of those who had fought to defend it. Trade wagons moved freely along roads that had once been death traps, and the smoke that rose from countless chimneys spoke of prosperity and peace rather than destruction and war. "Regrets?" asked Dwalin, joining him with the slow step that marked their advancing years, but the same steady presence that had characterized their friendship for nearly a century. "None," Thorin replied without hesitation. "Or at least, none that matter anymore. The choices we made, the prices we paid, they purchased something worth having. Look at what we've built, Dwalin. Look at what our children and their children will inherit." Below them, a group of young dwarves was training in the courtyard, their practice session supervised by one of the Memorial Guard's veterans. Among them were representatives of all the Alliance peoples, dwarf and man and elf learning together, training together, building the relationships that would carry the peace forward into whatever challenges the future might bring. "Do you think Bilbo would recognize the world we've made?" Dwalin asked. Thorin considered the question carefully, thinking of his old friend and the courage that had set everything in motion. "I think he would be surprised by the details," he said finally, "but pleased by the spirit of it. We've built something that honors the sacrifice he made, a world worth saving, and worth the price that was paid to save it." As the sun set over the valley where so much history had been written, Thorin reflected on the strange journey that had brought him from exile and dragon sickness to this moment of quiet satisfaction. He had learned, perhaps too late but not too late to matter, that the greatest treasures were not gold or jewels, but the bonds of friendship and the peace that such bonds could create when they were strong enough to endure. The weight of survival had become the weight of wisdom, and ultimately, the weight of legacy. Whatever else his life might have been, it had been spent in service to something greater than himself, something that would endure long after he passed into whatever rest awaited the kings of old. The Fourth Age was well begun, built on foundations of cooperation and understanding that had been purchased with blood and sacrifice, but maintained through wisdom and hope. It was enough. It was more than enough, and as Thorin made his way back into the warmth of Dale's great hall, where friends waited and stories were told and the future seemed bright with promise, he knew that every choice he had made, from that first desperate ride toward Bilbo's aid to this moment of quiet contentment, had been worth the price he had paid. The dragon sickness was truly cured, replaced by something far more valuable. The knowledge that a life spent in service to others was the greatest treasure any king could hope to claim.